Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where silence is law, cold is constant, and your knees will never forgive you. Picture this, you're kneeling on bare stone in a medieval chapel, surrounded by flickering shadows that dance across ancient walls. The air is thick with smoke from tallow candlesticks rendered animal fat, by the way, and the smell is somewhere between a butcher shop and a house fire. Monks in coarse wool robes chant in Latin all around you, their voices echoing off vaulted ceilings that seem to stretch into eternity itself. Your knees are already screaming, your back is already aching, and you've only been here for 20 minutes. There are still another 100 to go before Candlelit final prayer service of the night releases you to a bed. That's really just a wooden plank with a blanket thinner than your average beach towel. You probably won't survive this. And honestly, most people didn't choose to. Monasteries weren't exactly handing out brochures at the medieval career fair. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing how far this little community reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've arrived at the chapel just as the sun dips below the horizon, which in medieval terms means Compline is about to begin. Compline is the church's final official prayer service of the day, the bookend to a routine that started before dawn and hasn't let up since. If you're imagining some cozy evening devotional with soft hymns and warm candlelight, let me stop you right there. Compline in a medieval monastery is a full-contact spiritual sport. You're expected to kneel, not sit, not stand, but kneel on stone floors that have absorbed centuries of cold and somehow radiate it back up through your kneecaps like they're conducting a personal vendetta against your skeletal system. The chapel itself is vast and dark, illuminated only by those sputtering tallow candles I mentioned. Tallow, for the uninitiated, is animal fat rendered down and molded around a wick. It was cheap, available, and absolutely disgusting. Beeswax candles existed, sure, but those were reserved for the altar and special occasions. You get the budget option, and your lungs will pay for it. The monks file in wearing their habits, heavy wool robes that are never washed, only occasionally aired out. Some of these guys have been wearing the same robe for years, and you can tell. The smell is a living thing, a mix of sweat, lanolin from the wool, with smoke, and something vaguely fungal that you can't quite identify but definitely can't ignore. They take their places in the choir stalls, those tall wooden benches that line both sides of the chapel, and you're expected to find a spot on the floor. If you're a visitor, pilgrim, or some noble doing penance, you don't get a stall. You get stone. Cold, unforgiving, probably slightly damp stone. The service begins with the abbot, the head monk, basically the CEO of holiness, intoning a psalm. The others respond in a call and response pattern that's been perfected over centuries. This isn't casual prayer. This is liturgy, a precisely choreographed performance where every word, every gesture, every moment of silence is dictated by the rule of Saint Benedict, written way back in the 6th century. Benedict was the guy who basically invented Western monasticism, and his rule is part spiritual guide, part military drill manual. It dictates when you pray, when you eat, when you sleep, when you work, and crucially, when you shut up. Silence is a big deal in Benedictine monasteries. Outside of designated talking times, you communicate through sign language or not at all. Break the silence rule, you're doing extra penance, probably kneeling for even longer on even colder stone. Here's a fun historical fact. The Catholic Church divided the day into canonical hours, specific times when monks were required to gather and pray. There were 8 of these services spread across 24 hours. You had matins, midnight, or 2 a.m., depending on the season. Lauds, dawn. Prime, 6 a.m. Terce, 9 a.m. Sext, noon. None, 3 p.m. Vespers, sunset. And finally Compline, before bed. Each service lasted anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the complexity of the psalms and readings. Do the math and you'll realize monks spent somewhere between 4 to 6 hours per day just praying, not counting personal devotions. And you're expected to match that pace. Today, starting now, with knees that haven't built up the necessary calluses yet. The chanting continues. Latin words wash over you in waves, te lucis ante terminum, to thee before the close of day, and you realize you don't understand a single syllable. Latin was the language of the church, the language of learning, the language of people who had the luxury of education. Most medieval peasants spoke regional dialects or early versions of modern European languages, but the liturgy, pure Latin, all day, every day. You could attend services for years and never understand what was being said unless someone took pity on you and explained it afterward. Historians still argue whether this linguistic barrier was intentional, a way to maintain clerical authority, and mystique, or simply a practical continuation of Roman tradition. Either way, you're lost, and the monks don't seem inclined to provide subtitles. Your knees are definitely going numb now, that pins and needles sensation creeping up from your shins. You try to shift your weight slightly, and immediately the monk nearest you shoots you a look that could curdle milk. Movement during Compline is frowned upon. Actually, movement during any service is frowned upon. You're supposed to be a statue of devotion, immobile and focused, your mind fixed entirely on God and not at all on the fact that your left foot has fallen completely asleep and you're pretty sure you'll never walk normally again. The candlelight flickers, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Medieval chapels weren't well lit even by their own standards. Glass windows existed but were rare and expensive. Most chapels had narrow slits or wooden shutters to keep out the elements. At night, those shutters were closed, trapping the smoke inside along with you. Tallow candles produce a thick, greasy smoke that smells like burning meat because, well, that's essentially what it is. Breathe it in for hours and you'll develop a cough that medieval people just accepted as normal. Modern studies have shown that prolonged exposure to tallow smoke can cause respiratory issues, eye irritation, and headaches. But hey, at least you're saving your soul, right? One of the younger monks, a novice, probably 15 or 16 years old, starts to sway slightly in his stall. He's exhausted. Monasteries didn't believe in sleeping in. That matin service at midnight or 2 a.m., that was mandatory every single night, no exceptions. So this kid has probably been awake for close to 20 hours at this point, and he's got another hour of Compline ahead of him before he can collapse onto his wooden plank. The monk master, basically the monastery's disciplinarian, notices the swaying and makes a subtle gesture. The kid jerks upright, suddenly very awake, very aware that he almost earned himself a public penance. Penances could range from extra prayers to fasting to genuinely uncomfortable physical punishments. The rule of Benedict technically discouraged excessive physical discipline, but excessive was interpreted pretty liberally depending on who was in charge. You're probably wondering why anyone would choose this life. Here's the quirky historical tidbit. Many didn't choose it at all. Oblation was a medieval practice where parents essentially donated their children to monasteries, sometimes as young as 7 or 8 years old. These oblates grew up in the monastery, never knowing any other life, trained from childhood to endure exactly this kind of routine. Some oblates genuinely embraced their calling and became devoted monks. Others, well, medieval chronicles hint at plenty of reluctant monks who counted the days until they could find some excuse to leave, though leaving was extremely difficult and often impossible. You took vows: poverty, chastity, obedience, and those vows were considered binding for life. Breaking them could result in excommunication, social ostracism, and in some cases, actual imprisonment. The abbot raises his hand, and the chanting shifts to a different psalm. The monks respond in perfect unison, their voices blending into a sound that's almost hypnotic. You have to admit, despite the discomfort, despite the smoke and the cold and the numbness spreading through your lower body, there's something deeply powerful about this moment. These men have stripped away every distraction, every comfort, every element of normal life to focus entirely on what they believe is the most important thing: communion with God. Whether you share their faith or not, you can't deny the commitment. They've built their entire existence around this schedule, this routine, this endless cycle of prayer and work and sleep that defines every moment from cradle to grave. Another 20 minutes pass. Your knees have transcended pain and entered some weird realm of non-feeling that's almost worse. You're pretty sure they're still attached to your body, but you can't prove it without looking. And looking down during Compline would definitely earn you that disapproving glare again. The candles have burned down noticeably, their flames guttering in the slight draft that sneaks through gaps in the stone walls. Medieval builders were skilled, but airtight wasn't really in their vocabulary. Every chapel, every monastery, every church had drafts, and those drafts turned winter into a special kind of torture we'll get to later. Finally, Finalith Abbot intones the closing prayers. Benedicamus Domino, let us bless the Lord. And the monks respond, Deo gratias, thanks be to God. You try to stand and immediately regret every life choice that brought you to this moment. Your legs don't work. They're just gone. You topple sideways slightly, catching yourself on the stone floor with one hand, and now your palm is scraped and cold, and you're fairly certain the monks are judging you. They probably are. Grace under pressure is a monastic virtue, and you're failing spectacularly. The monks file out in silence, heading toward their dormitory for a few precious hours of sleep before matins shatters the night. You're left alone in the chapel for a moment, surrounded by dying candles and that pervasive tallow stench. Welcome to day 1, or, more accurately, welcome to hour 2. You've got at least 14 more waking hours ahead of you before you're allowed to even think about sleep. And trust me, that sleep won't be restful. But we'll get there. First, we need to talk about those candles and the fact that they're actively trying to kill you. You finally manage to coax your legs back into functional status. That agonizing pins and needles sensation flooding through your calves as blood flow returns. Standing fully upright takes longer than you'd like to admit. And you notice one of the older monks, a brother with a beard that's gone completely white, watching you from the doorway. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't need to. His expression conveys everything. You're soft, you're unprepared, and you're probably not going to make it. He's seen dozens of visitors, pilgrims, and would-be monks come through these doors. and he can spot the ones who'll flee back to secular life within hours. You're definitely registering on that list. The chapel is emptying now, but you notice a few monks remaining behind. These are the fire watchers, the brothers assigned to ensure those tallow candles are properly extinguished or monitored throughout the night. Fire was one of the greatest dangers in medieval buildings. Everything was wood and stone and cloth, all perfect fuel for flames. A single unattended candle could reduce an entire monastery to ash in hours, and it happened more often than you'd think. Chronicles from the period are full of accounts of churches and monasteries burning down, often with tragic loss of life. So the fire watch was taken seriously. These monks will stay here for the next few hours, making sure every flame is either out or safely contained, before another brother relieves them. It's tedious, it's boring, and it's absolutely necessary. You shuffle toward the exit, your gait probably resembling some creature that's forgotten how legs work. The cold hits you immediately as you step into the cloisterthats, the covered walkway that connects different parts of the monastery. Even though you're technically indoors, the cloister is open to the elements on one side, looking onto a central courtyard. There's no glass, no barriers, just stone columns and the night air pouring in. Your breath becomes visible instantly, little clouds that dissipate in the darkness. This is early November in our scenario, which means temperatures are hovering somewhere around 40 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 4 to 7 degrees Celsius for the rest of the world. That might not sound unbearable, but remember, you've been kneeling on frozen stone for 2 hours. You're wearing whatever clothes you arrived in, probably not heavy medieval wool. And there's no central heating in your future. None. Zero. Not even a little bit. The monk master appears beside you silently, because of course he does, and gestures for you to follow. Speaking after Compline is forbidden, part of the great silence that extends from the end of the final service until after morning mass the next day. You trail behind him through the cloister, past the chapter house where monks gather for daily meetings, past the refectory where meals happen in their own special kind of silence, and finally to a small cell that will serve as your quarters. Cell is the right word. It's tiny, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with a wooden plank bed, a small shelf for personal items, of which you have none, and a crucifix on the wall. That's it. No chair, no desk, no storage chest. Monks didn't accumulate possessions. The rule of Benedict was explicit about this. Personal ownership was forbidden. Everything belonged to the community, doled out by the abbot as needed and reclaimed at death. The monk master points to the bed, then to a rough woolen blanket folded at its foot, then to the small clay lamp sitting on the shelf. He makes a sign, 2 fingers moving from his eyes to the lamp, which you interpret as "don't waste oil." Oil lamps were another precious commodity, usually reserved for reading or essential nighttime tasks. Sleeping in darkness was the norm. He leaves, pulling the wooden door closed behind him with a soft thud that echoes in the tiny space. You're alone now, truly alone for the first time since arriving. The cell is dark except for a sliver of moonlight coming through a narrow window slit near the ceiling. You can't see much, but you can feel everything. The cold radiating from the stone walls, the roughness of the blanket as you pick it up, the hardness of the bed as you sit down experimentally. Calling it a bed is generous. It's a wooden frame with leather straps stretched across it, creating a surface that has about as much give as a park bench. No mattress, no padding, just the straps and that blanket between you and a very uncomfortable night. But you're not sleeping yet. Remember, Matins is coming. Depending on the season and the particular monastery's interpretation of the rule, that could be anywhere from 4 to 6 hours from now. Some monasteries held matins at midnight sharp. Others waited until 2 a.m. The idea was that monks should be praying during the darkest, coldest, most inhospitable part of the night as a form of sacrifice and devotion. Your body desperately wants to lie down, to close your eyes, to escape into unconsciousness. But there's a bell tower in this monastery, and that bell will ring when matins begins, and you will be expected to get up, get dressed if you undressed, and return to that chapel for another round of kneeling and chanting and incomprehensible Latin. You lie back on the plank bed, pulling the blanket up to your chin. It smells like old wool and smoke, because everything here smells like old wool and smoke. The cold seeps through immediately. That thin blanket is doing almost nothing against the November chill, and you're already starting to shiver. Medieval people had different relationships with discomfort than we do. They didn't have thermostats or electric blankets or heated mattresses. Cold was just a fact of life for half the year, something you endured rather than eliminated. Monks considered physical discomfort spiritually beneficial, a way to mortify the flesh and focus the mind on higher things. You, however, are focusing mainly on how much you want a space heater and 3 more blankets. Outside your cell, the monastery is settling into its nighttime rhythm. You can hear the occasional footfall of a monk moving through the cloister, the distant creak of a door, the ever-present whisper of wind through stone corridors. There's no talking, no conversation, no human warmth of voices and laughter. Just silence, cold, and the knowledge that in a few short hours, that bell will ring and this whole thing starts over. You close your eyes and try to convince yourself that you can handle this. You've done uncomfortable things before. You've gone camping. You've had bad hotel rooms. How different can this be? The answer, as you're about to discover through the long medieval night ahead, is very different indeed. The candles are still burning when you drift into an uneasy half-sleep on your wooden plank. And that's the first problem. In the modern world, we flip a switch and get clean, consistent light from LEDs or incandescents that burn without smoke, without smell, without danger. Medieval people had fire. That's it. Fire in every possible form: torches, oil lamps, rushlights, and predominantly those tallow candles we've already established you're going to hate. But you don't fully appreciate the horror of medieval lighting until you're living in it, breathing it, watching it consume resources and oxygen in equal measure while providing barely enough illumination to navigate a hallway without walking into a wall. Tallow candles were the working-class heroes of medieval illumination, and by heroes, I mean necessary evils that everyone tolerated because the alternative was sitting in complete darkness. They were made from rendered animal fat, usually beef or mutton tallow, though pork fat worked in a pinch. The process was fairly straightforward. You took fatty tissue from slaughtered animals, heated it until the fat melted and separated from the membranes and impurities, strained it, then poured it into molds with wicks or repeatedly dipped wicks into the liquid fat until you built up enough layers to create a burnable candle. The result was a grayish-white cylinder that smelled faintly rancid even before you lit it and turned genuinely offensive once flame hit wick. When tallow burns, produces a thick, greasy smoke that carries the unmistakable aroma of cooking meat. And not good cooking meat, we're talking the smell of fat dripping onto a too-hot pan, that acrid, slightly nauseating scent that makes you want to open every window in the house. except you can't open windows in a medieval chapel, because there essentially aren't any, just those narrow slits we mentioned earlier. So the smoke accumulates, hanging in layers near the ceiling, gradually working its way down into the breathable atmosphere. Spend a few hours in a tallow-lit room and you'll develop a cough. Your eyes will water constantly, and your hair and clothes will absorb that smell so thoroughly that you'll carry it with you for days. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Tallow candles were so smoky and unreliable that wealthy households and churches would sometimes employ a candle servant whose entire job was to monitor candles, trim wicks, replace burned-down stubs, and manage the constant fire hazard. In monasteries, this duty rotated among the brothers as part of their regular work assignments. It was considered a lowly task, the kind of thing assigned to novices or brothers doing penance for infractions. You spent your evening watching waxwell, fat drip and smoke, making sure nothing caught fire, all while trying to stay awake during the stretches between prayer services. Fun times. Beeswax candles were the luxury option, the medieval equivalent of premium lighting. Beeswax burned cleaner, produced a pleasant honey-like scent, gave off a brighter light, and lasted significantly longer than tallow. But it was expensive, really expensive. Beeswax had to be harvested from beehives, processed to remove debris, then molded or rolled into candles. A pound of beeswax could cost 10 to 20 times more than a pound of tallow, which meant most monasteries reserved beeswax exclusively for the altar candles used during Mass. Those were the holy flames, the ones that represented Christ as the light of the world, and they got the good stuff. Everything else, hallway lighting, cell lamps, work candles, ran on budget tallow that slowly poisoned your lungs. You're experiencing this firsthand now, even in your tiny cell. That small clay oil lamp the monk master pointed out, it's burning what's probably rapeseed oil or another vegetable-based fuel. And while it's cleaner than tallow, it's still producing smoke and consuming oxygen in your already poorly ventilated space. The flame is tiny, barely bigger than a birthday candle, but you can see the black carbon deposits forming on the ceiling above it, a testament to countless nights of monks sleeping in rooms lit by these primitive devices. Your throat feels scratchy. Your eyes are definitely irritated. And you've only been here for a few hours. Imagine years of this, decades, an entire lifetime of breathing smoke because the alternative is stumbling around in pitch darkness and probably breaking your neck on a stone staircase. The fire risk was absolutely real and absolutely terrifying. Medieval chronicles are full of catastrophic fires that destroyed monasteries, churches, entire towns. In 1212, a fire at the Benedictine monastery of Bury St. Edmunds in England destroyed much of the complex, including priceless manuscripts and relics. The fire reportedly started from an unattended candle in one of the monks' cells. Sound familiar? Wooden roof beams, hay-stuffed mattresses in fancier monasteries, woolen wall hangings, stored grain, dried herbs, all of it perfect kindling waiting for a single spark. Fire watches weren't paranoia, they were survival strategy. So every night, multiple monks stayed awake in shifts, patrolling the monastery corridors with their own candles. Ironic, right? Checking that all flames were either extinguished or properly contained. They'd peer into cells, walk through the chapel, inspect the kitchen and refectory, anywhere fire might lurk unsupervised. This duty was exhausting, especially layered on top of the already brutal sleep schedule we'll discuss in detail soon. But the alternative, waking up to find your home engulfed in flames, your brothers trapped in their cells, the chapel you've prayed in for years collapsing in a roar of heat and smoke, was worse than any amount of lost sleep. Let's talk about light levels, because this is something modern people genuinely cannot fathom. A single tallow candle produces maybe 12 to 13 lumens of light. For comparison, a standard 60-watt incandescent bulb produces about 800 lumens. One modern bathroom vanity light produces more illumination than every candle in a medieval chapel combined. So when you're sitting in that chapel for Compline, surrounded by maybe 20 or 30 candles, you're working with roughly 300 to 400 lumens spread across a space that might be 2,000 to 3,000 square feet. Do the math, and you realize you're operating in what we'd consider deep twilight, that moment just after sunset when you can see shapes and outlines but details get fuzzy and shadows dominate everything. Reading by candlelight was genuinely difficult and genuinely damaging to eyesight. Monks who worked as scribes, copying manuscripts by hand, often developed vision problems by their 30s or 40s. They'd sit hunched over parchment with a candle positioned as close as safely possible, squinting at tiny letters, straining to distinguish black ink from yellowed vellum in the wavering light. Historians still argue whether the high rate of vision problems in literate medieval populations was due to the poor lighting, the lack of corrective lenses. Eyeglasses weren't common until the late 13th century, or simply the natural aging process that affected everyone but was only documented in people whose work required good vision. Probably all three. Honestly, you'd think the church would have figured out a better system. But remember, suffering was kind of the point. Monastic life wasn't supposed to be comfortable. It was supposed to be a constant reminder of human mortality, physical limitation, and dependence on God. Living in smoky dimness, working by inadequate light, accepting the ever-present risk of fire, all of that fit perfectly into the medieval religious worldview that valued spiritual development over physical comfort. Plus, the technology simply didn't exist for anything better. Electricity was centuries away. Gas lighting was centuries away. Even improved candle-making techniques that would create cleaner burning tallow were still generations in the future. So you adapted, like humans always do. Your eyes adjusted to the dimness. Your lungs accommodated the smoke. And you learned to move carefully through shadowy corridors where one misstep could mean a nasty fall. You learned which candles burned faster, which ones required more frequent wick trimming, which ones would gutter out in a draft and leave you stranded in darkness. The brothers who'd been here for years could navigate the entire monastery in near total darkness, their feet knowing every uneven stone, every step, every threshold by touch and memory. You, however, are new, clumsy, and absolutely guaranteed to crash into something humiliating before your first week is done. The candles in the chapel are probably down to stubs by now. Those last desperate inches before the flame hits the metal or clay holder and extinguishes itself. The monk on fire watch will replace them soon, pulling new candles from the monastery storage and positioning them in the same holders, continuing the endless cycle. Making tallow candles was often a communal task during slaughter season, usually late autumn. Around November, when animals were culled before winter to reduce the number of mouths to feed, the monks would render fat for days, filling the monastery with the smell of cooking meat, producing enough candles to last through the winter months when livestock was scarce and tallow production impossible. And here's something we don't often consider: the sheer amount of animal fat required to light a monastery for a year. A medium-sized monastery might house 20 to 30 monks, plus servants, plus visitors. If each candle burns for about 4 to 6 hours and you need, say, 30 candles burning at any given time during evening hours, you're going through a lot of tallow. Some estimates suggest a monastery might consume hundreds of pounds of tallow annually just for basic lighting, not counting cooking fat or other uses. That represented a significant portion of the livestock they raised or purchased, all of it literally going up in smoke to push back the darkness for a few hours each night. You're probably wondering about other lighting methods. Rushlights were common in poorer households. These were rushes, the plant, soaked in fat and burned like slow-burning torches. They were cheaper than candles but produced even less light and even more smoke. Oil lamps, like the one in your cell, were common in Mediterranean regions where olive oil was abundant, but in Northern Europe, vegetable oils were more expensive than tallow, so candles dominated. Torches, wooden sticks wrapped in cloth and soaked in pitch or resin, were used outdoors or in large halls but were wildly impractical for close quarters indoor use because they showered sparks and burned out quickly. The darkness was oppressive in ways we literally cannot experience in the modern developed world. When those candles went out, you were in absolute blackness. Not dark room darkness where a little light bleeds under the door or from a street lamp outside. Absolute, complete, disorienting darkness where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. This is why medieval people went to bed when it got dark and rose with the sun. There was simply no practical way to do much of anything after sunset except sleep or pray by expensive candlelight. The canonical hours were timed partly around light availability. Matins in the middle of the night, that required candles. Lauds at dawn, free natural light. Prime, terce, sext, none. Vespersal scheduled to take advantage of daylight as much as possible. In your cell right now, that tiny oil lamp is fighting a losing battle against the encroaching darkness. The flame flickers with every breath you take, every slight movement of air. If it goes out, you're relighting it from what exactly? Matches didn't exist. Lighters didn't exist. You'd need to either keep a coal burning in a metal container, impractical and dangerous in a small cell, or stumble through the dark monastery to find someone else's flame and borrow it. So you guard that tiny light jealously, making sure your blanket doesn't accidentally smother it, making sure the oil reservoir has enough fuel to last until morning. The fire watch brother passes your door, you hear his sandals scuffing on stone, and pauses just long enough to verify you haven't accidentally started a conflagration. His candle sends shadows dancing under your door, then moves on, leaving you alone again with your sputtering lamp and increasingly smoke-irritated airways. This is your reality now. Not for one night, but potentially for life if you'd actually committed to monastic living. Every evening lit by toxic tallow. Every night punctuated by fire watches. Every dawn revealing the black soot deposits on ceilings and walls, the physical evidence of medieval humanity's nightly battle against darkness. And the worst part? This is actually one of the more manageable hardships. The cold waiting in the coming hours makes smoky candles look like a minor inconvenience. But you'll discover that soon enough. For now, close your eyes against the smoke, try to ignore your scratchy throat, and catch whatever sleep you can before that bell rings for matins and the whole exhausting cycle begins again. Remember that candle smoke? It's going to be there too. Fresh and toxic and inescapable. Welcome to Medieval Night Shift. Population, you and your rapidly deteriorating respiratory system. The soot is everywhere once you start noticing it. That's the thing about living with constant smoke. Initially you see the flames and maybe register the smell. But then your eyes adjust and you start seeing the physical residue. The ceiling of your cell has black streaks radiating out from where that oil lamp sits on its shelf. Decades of carbon deposits creating patterns that look almost intentional, like some grim artwork commemorating every monk who slept in this space before you. The walls near candle sconces in the cloister show the same staining, and if you were to run your finger along these surfaces, which you won't, because that would be disgusting, you'd come away with a black, greasy residue that wouldn't wash off easily. Medieval people cleaned these surfaces occasionally, usually scrubbing with lye soap or lime wash, but it was a losing battle. The moment you relit the candles, the soot started accumulating again. Some monasteries just accepted the blackened ceilings as normal, part of the aesthetic of monastic life. Others tried to maintain standards of cleanliness that required constant labor. Guess who got assigned soot-scrubbing duty? If you guessed the newest arrivals and the brothers doing penance, you'd be absolutely correct. Nothing says spiritual growth quite like standing on a rickety ladder with a bucket of caustic soap, scrubbing years of smoke damage off stone that will be black again in a month. There's also the matter of what happens when candles aren't monitored properly. Tallow has a relatively low melting point. It starts softening around 100 to 105 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 to 40 degrees Celsius. In warm weather or near heat sources, tallow candles could literally sag and deform, bending like something from a Salvador Dali painting. They'd lean in their holders, drip excessively, sometimes collapse entirely into puddles of solidified fat. Monks learned to store tallow candles in cool, dark places, to rotate stock so older candles got used first, to trim wicks frequently so the flame didn't grow too large and melt the candle too quickly. Wick trimming was an art form. Actually, let a wick grow too long and the flame gets large, burning through fuel quickly while producing maximum smoke. Trim it too short and the candle might extinguish itself. The ideal was a flame maybe half an inch tall, steady and consistent, providing adequate light without excessive smoke or fuel consumption. Brothers on candle duty carried small scissors or specialized wick trimmers, making rounds through the monastery every couple of hours to adjust flames. It was tedious, never-ending work, but necessary if you wanted lighting that was even marginally reliable. And here's something that probably never crossed your mind: seasonal variations in candle quality. Tallow rendered in winter, when animals were fattiest before the lean spring months, was generally superior to summer tallow. It was denser, burned longer, held its shape better. Monasteries planned their slaughter schedules accordingly, trying to render as much tallow as possible during the optimal months. But by late spring or early summer, when winter stores were depleted and new tallow wasn't yet available, candle quality suffered noticeably. You'd get candles that burned faster, smoked more, melted at the slightest warmth. Monks in regions with hot summers sometimes had to abandon tallow candles entirely during July and August, relying instead on oil lamps or simply accepting reduced lighting. You shift on your wooden bed, trying to find a position that doesn't result in immediate discomfort, and your movement makes the lamp flame dance wildly. Shadows leap across the walls like living things, and for a moment you understand why medieval people believed in spirits and demons lurking in dark places. When your only experience of darkness is this incomplete, flickering, full of moving shadows that could be anything, the supernatural seems entirely plausible. Every shadow could hide something. Every corner is impenetrable. Every night is an exercise in trusting that the darkness contains nothing harmful, even though you absolutely cannot verify that with your eyes. The lamp is burning down now, the oil level dropping visibly in the small reservoir. You have maybe another hour of light, perhaps two if the fuel was filled generously. After that, darkness, complete and absolute. The monk master didn't provide you with extra oil, and you're definitely not going to go wandering the monastery at night looking for a refill. So you'll sleep in darkness, wake in darkness for matins, and stumble toward the chapel guided only by the distant glow of candles and whatever moonlight makes it through those narrow window slits. Medieval people developed excellent night vision out of sheer necessity, but your modern eyes, accustomed to LED streetlights and smartphone screens, are going to struggle embarrassingly. Think about what this meant for daily life beyond just lighting. Reading after dark was a luxury activity reserved for important work, because it required dedicated candle use for one person. Socializing after dark was rare, because gathering multiple people required multiple candles, multiplying the cost. Accidents increased after sunset, people tripping on stairs, missing doorways, stumbling into furniture or walls. The famous medieval practice of night soil collection, yes, that's a euphemism for human waste removal, was particularly hazardous because workers were operating in darkness or near darkness, navigating narrow streets and alleyways with minimal lighting. Your oil lamp gives one final sputter and you realize it's dying faster than expected. Maybe there's a draft you haven't noticed, or maybe the oil quality is poor, or maybe you just got unlucky. The flame shrinks to almost nothing, wavers, then extinguishes with a tiny trail of smoke that adds one more layer of acridity to the air you're breathing. And just like that, you're in darkness. Total, disorienting darkness. You can't see the walls, can't see your hand, can't see anything. Your other senses sharpen immediately. You hear the wind outside more clearly now. Hear distant footsteps that might be real or might be your imagination. Hear your own breathing suddenly loud in the enclosed space. This is your home now, for as long as you stay. This darkness, this smoke, this constant negotiation with fire and its absolute necessity balanced against its mortal danger. Medieval monks weren't ignorant of the risks or the discomfort. They chose this life, or had it chosen for the man, accepted every hardship as part of the spiritual journey. You, however, are really starting to question your life choices, and you haven't even made it to midnight yet. That bell is going to ring. You're going to have to get up, navigate this darkness, and return to that smoke-filled chapel for matins. And then you're going to do it all again, and again. Welcome to the eternal cycle of medieval monastic life, where the light always fails and morning never comes soon enough. The cold wakes you before the bell does, which is probably a blessing because at least you're not being jolted from deep sleep into freezing misery. Instead, you're easing from uncomfortable semi-consciousness into full awareness that you cannot feel your toes. They're still attitude-y, pretty sure, but they've entered that numb zone where you genuinely can't tell if they're cold or if they've simply ceased to exist as functional body parts. You're curled into a ball under your pathetically thin blanket, knees drawn to your chest, arms wrapped around yourself, and you're still shivering. The air in your cell is so cold that each exhale produces a visible cloud of condensation. Even in the darkness, you can hear it more than see it, that slight whisper of moisture freezing in the air before dissipating into the blackness. Medieval people didn't have central heating. Let me repeat that because it's important. They had absolutely zero central heating. No forced air systems, no radiators, no underfloor heating like the Romans had enjoyed 1,000 years earlier. That technology was lost. forgotten, deemed unnecessary or too expensive, or simply beyond the engineering capabilities of medieval builders who were focused on other priorities like structural integrity and defensive fortifications. What they had instead was fire. Fireplaces in great halls for nobility. Braziers, essentially metal bowls filled with burning charcoal in slightly better monastic quarters. And in places like your cell, nothing. Absolutely nothing. The heat source is your own body, that thin blanket, and the vague hope that stone walls might retain some thermal mass from the day. Spoiler alert, they don't. Stone is an excellent building material for many reasons. It's durable, fire-resistant, readily available in many regions, and can be shaped into impressive architectural forms that last centuries. Stone is also phenomenally good at conducting cold directly into your bones. Those walls surrounding you right now are basically giant heat sinks, absorbing any warmth your body generates and radiating cold in return. During winter, stone buildings become refrigerators. The walls are cold. The floor is colder. The air itself seems to have weight, a heavy, damp coldness that settles into your lungs and makes every breath feel like work. The monastery you're in was built sometime in the 12th century, we'll say around 1150 for specificity, in northern France, though it could just as easily be England, Germany, or anywhere else in northern Europe where Benedictine monasteries flourished. The architecture follows standard patterns: thick stone walls, narrow windows, high ceilings in the chapel and chapter house, lower ceilings in the dormitory and cells. High ceilings are magnificent for acoustics and creating that sense of divine space, but they're terrible for heat retention. Warm air rises, which means it rises right up to those vaulted ceilings and stays there, completely out of reach of the shivering humans below. Meanwhile, cold air pools at floor level, where you're trying to sleep, creating a temperature gradient that could easily span 20 degrees from floor to ceiling. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval Europeans wore significantly more clothing than we typically do, and they wore it in layers specifically designed for insulation. The standard monastic habit consisted of multiple pieces: a linen undertunic worn directly against the skin, a woolen tunic over that, the outer robe, the recognizable brown or black habit, a scapular, a long cloth apron worn over the habit, and in winter, an additional woolen cloak. Monks also wore hoods, heavy woolen socks, and leather or wooden shoes. When sleeping, many monks kept most of their clothing on, removing only the outer robe and perhaps the scapular. The idea of sleeping in minimal clothing, or God forbid naked, would have struck them as insane. Clothing was insulation, and insulation was survival. You're still wearing whatever you arrived in, and it's not enough. Not remotely enough. You're probably in something approximating modern casual clothing pants, a shirt, maybe a jacket, but none of it is designed for spending 12 hours in a building that's essentially an outdoor temperature with a roof. Medieval wool was different from modern wool, too. It was thicker, oilier, less processed, which made it more water-resistant and more insulating, but also scratchier and heavier. The monks around you are wearing robes that weigh 15 to 20 pounds when dry, significantly more when damp from rain or snow. That weight is distributed across their entire bodies, creating a constant compressive warmth. You, in your modern lightweight clothing, might as well be wearing tissue paper. The bell rings. Of course it does. You knew it was coming, but somehow the reality of that sound cutting through the frozen darkness is still shocking. It's not a gentle chime or a melodic tone. Medieval church bells were heavy bronze affairs that produced deep, resonant sounds capable of carrying for miles across the countryside. Inside the monastery walls, the sound is overwhelming, bouncing off stone surfaces, reverberating through your skull. The bell ringer is in the Toera brother, probably even more miserable than you, standing in an unheated belfry pulling ropes in the middle of the night, and he's ringing the sequence that signals matins. 3 sets of 3 tolls. A pause, then repeat. It's unmistakable and inescapable. You have to get up. There's no snooze button here. No 5 more minutes negotiation. The rule of Benedict is explicit. When the bell rings for divine office, monks must drop whatever they're doing and proceed immediately to the chapel. Immediately. The monk master is probably already moving through the dormitory, checking that everyone is rising. Laggards face penance. You throw off your blanket, not difficult, since it's providing minimal benefit anyway, and your body immediately protests. The air temperature in your cell is probably around 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. Your breath comes in great clouds now that you're moving. Your fingers are stiff, uncooperative. Your feet on the stone floor feel like you've stepped onto ice. Historians still argue whether medieval people were just tougher than modern humans, or whether they suffered constantly and simply had no alternative, so they endured it. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Human bodies can adapt to chronic cold exposure. Your metabolism increases slightly. Your circulation patterns adjust. You develop better conservation of core heat. But that adaptation takes weeks or months. And it doesn't eliminate suffering. It just makes suffering manageable. Medieval people absolutely felt the cold, complained about it in letters and chronicles, and died from exposure-related illnesses at rates we'd find horrifying today. Pneumonia, frostbite, hypothermia, these were legitimate dangers, especially for the elderly, the very young, and anyone whose health was already compromised. You shuffle toward your cell door, arms wrapped around yourself, teeth chattering. The door opens. Outward fire safety measure ensures doors can't be blocked from outside, and the corridor beyond is somehow even colder than your cell. The cloister is fully exposed to the November night air, and that air is moving through the corridor like a living thing, a presence that pushes against you and finds every gap in your inadequate clothing. Other monks are emerging from their cells, silent per the Great Silence Rule, moving like ghosts through the darkness. A few candles have been lit in wall sconces, providing just enough light to see shapes and avoid collisions. The monks are completely unsurprised by the cold. They move with the efficiency of people who've done this exact routine thousands of times, their hands tucked into opposite sleeves of their robes to preserve warmth, their hoods pulled up, their postures slightly hunched to conserve heat. You try to imitate them but fail spectacularly because your modern body has no muscle memory for this kind of controlled hypothermic shuffling. You probably look like a disaster victim stumbling toward emergency services. The procession moves toward the chapel, feet scuffing on stone, breath condensing in group clouds that hang in the still air before slowly dissipating. No one speaks. No one needs to. Everyone knows where they're going, what they're doing, how long it will take. You file into the chapel still lit by those tallow candles, fresh ones replacing the evening stubs, and return to your spot on the floor. The stone is somehow even colder than it was during Compline. You'd think stone would retain heat, but no. It's a cold conductor, a thermal vampire, and kneeling on it now feels like kneeling on the frozen ground outside. Your knees make contact and immediately begin screaming protest. The pain is different from the pressure pain of earlier. This is cold pain. Sharp and immediate, radiating up through your kneecaps into your thighs. The abbot begins the service. More Latin psalms, more antiphonal chanting, more standing and sitting and kneeling in prescribed patterns that everyone knows except you. Your body is shaking now, small involuntary shivers that you cannot control. The monk nearest you glances over with what might be sympathy or might be disdain, hard to tell in the flickering candlelight. The cold is all-consuming. It's not just physical discomfort. It's cognitive impairment. Your thoughts are slow, sluggish. You're having trouble following the rhythm of the service. Trouble remembering to stand when others stand. Trouble doing anything except focusing on the cold and wishing desperately for warmth. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some monasteries in particularly harsh climates allowed for limited heating in the kale factory, a special warming room where monks could go for brief periods to thaw out. The kale factory usually had a fireplace or brazier burning during winter months, and brothers were permitted to spend short intervals there, maybe 15 minutes, a few times per day, to prevent serious cold-related injuries. But not all monasteries had kale factories, and those that did strictly regulated access. Too much warmth made you soft, distracted you from spiritual focus, encouraged physical indulgence. So even when heat was available, it was doled out sparingly, reluctantly, as a necessary evil rather than a comfort. This monastery doesn't have a kale factory. Of course it doesn't. You're in a strict Benedictine house that interprets the rule conservatively, which means heat is for cooking and candle making, not for human comfort. The chapel has no fireplace, no braziers, nothing. The only warmth comes from collective body heat 30-ish monks in an enclosed space, and it's not nearly enough. The temperature inside the chapel is maybe 5 degrees warmer than outside, which means you're still operating in near-freezing conditions. Your hands are shaking so badly you can't clasp them properly in prayer position. Your jaw is clenched to prevent teeth chattering. Your feet have progressed beyond numb into a weird, painful tingling that suggests the beginnings of frostbite, though you won't actually get frostbite from one night of this. Probably. The service continues. Matins is one of the longer offices, sometimes lasting 90 minutes or more depending on the liturgical calendar. Tonight appears to be a fairly standard night, no major feast day requiring extra psalms, but you're still looking at an hour minimum of kneeling, standing, sitting, and trying not to visibly fall apart from hypothermia. The monks chant with voices that sound almost normal, though if you listen carefully you can hear the slight breathiness that comes from singing in cold air, the way their breath catches occasionally. They're cold too. They're just better at hiding it, better at functioning through it, better at accepting it as the unchangeable reality of their existence. Modern humans live in climate-controlled environments. We keep our homes between 68 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. We have heated cars, heated offices, heated stores. We own winter coats rated for specific temperatures, insulated boots, thermal underwear, hand warmers. If we're cold, we add layers or adjust the thermostat. The concept of being constantly cold for months at a time, cold while sleeping, cold while eating, cold while working, cold while praying, just so foreign to our experience that we literally cannot imagine it. But that was reality for the vast majority of humans throughout most of history, and it's your reality right now. Your teeth start chattering despite your best efforts. The sound is audible in the quiet chapel, a soft clicking that seems thunderously loud to your ears. The monk master shifts his gaze toward you, and you force your jaw to stillness through sheer willpower. It works for maybe 30 seconds before the shivering reasserts control. This is miserable. This is genuinely, objectively miserable, and you've been here for less than 12 hours. The monks around you will do this every night for decades. Some of them are elderly, in their 60s or 70s, still kneeling on frozen stone in the middle of the night because the rule demands it and their faith sustains them through the physical suffering. The cold is also dangerous in ways beyond immediate discomfort. Chronic cold exposure suppresses immune function, making you more susceptible to respiratory infections. It increases blood pressure and cardiac stress. It interferes with sleep quality, which creates a cascade of health problems. Medieval monasteries saw regular outbreaks of pneumonia, bronchitis, and other cold-related illnesses, especially during harsh winters. Some monks died from these illnesses. It wasn't common enough to depopulate monasteries, but it happened often enough that every community had buried brothers who'd essentially frozen to death slowly over the course of a winter, their bodies unable to fight off infections that healthy immune systems might have handled. The abbot concludes matins with the final blessing, and the monks begin filing out. You attempt to stand and discover your legs have other ideas. They're not cooperating. The combination of cold and kneeling pressure has temporarily disabled your lower body, and you have to catch yourself on the floor with both hands to avoid face-planting on the stone. Graceful, really nailing this whole medieval monk aesthetic. One of the older brothers, the white-bearded one from earlier pauses, and offers you a hand up. His hand is warm, surprisingly so, and you realize he's been sitting in a choir stall rather than kneeling on the floor. Position has its privileges. Apparently, you're upright now, though upright is generous. You're more like vertical and swaying. The procession shuffles back toward the dormitory for the few remaining hours of sleep before lauds at dawn. Your cell awaits, still freezing, still dark, still equipped with only that thin blanket and wooden plank. You collapse onto the bed fully clothed this time, not even bothering to remove your shoes, and pull the blanket over yourself like armor against the cold. It doesn't help much, but it helps marginally, and marginal is all you're going to get. Outside, the November wind picks up, whistling through gaps in the stone walls, finding every crack and crevice. The monastery settles into its nighttime sounds, creaking wood, shifting stones, the distant hoot of an owl, and you lie there, shivering, exhausted, knowing that in maybe 3 hours you'll have to do this all over again for lauds. The cold isn't going anywhere. It's permanent, omnipresent, the defining characteristic of your existence now. Welcome to medieval winter, where warmth is memory and spring is a theological concept you'll have to take on faith. You've barely managed to drift into something resembling sleep that's shallow, unsatisfying half-consciousness where you're aware of the cold and the hardness beneath you, but your brain has temporarily given up trying to process it when the bell rings again. Lauds, dawn prayers, the official start of the monastic day, which is hilarious because you've already been awake once in the middle of the night and it feels like you haven't slept at all. Which, functionally, you haven't. Maybe 90 minutes total if you're generous with your estimate, broken into fragments between matins and now, none of it restful, all of it punctuated by shivering and discomfort. The bell's tone sounds different in the pre-dawn darkness, somehow both urgent and mournful. You open your eyes to absolute blackness. Your oil lamp burned out hours ago and no one refilled it. Because why would they? And for a moment you genuinely cannot remember where you are. The disorientation is complete. Then the cold reasserts itself. Your body's aches and pains provide context, and memory floods back. Right? Medieval monastery. Still here. Still freezing. Still expected to haul yourself out of this excuse for a bed and return to that stone-floored chapel for another round of incomprehensible Latin chanting. This is your new normal. Sleep deprivation as spiritual practice. The canonical hours weren't designed with human circadian rhythms in mind. They were designed around a theological framework that divided the 24-hour day into segments of prayer, ensuring that worship continued literally around the clock. God never slept. The reasoning went, so neither should God's servants, or at least. They should sleep as little as possible while still maintaining basic function. The result is a schedule that would violate labor laws in every modern nation. A routine so punishing that your body never fully adjusts. You just become increasingly exhausted until exhaustion itself becomes your baseline state. Let's break down exactly what you're facing sleep-wise. Compline ends around 8 p.m. Matins ring somewhere between midnight and 2 a.m. We'll say 2 a.m. for this monastery's particular tradition. That gives you maybe 5 to 6 hours of potential sleep. Except it's not continuous sleep. You're sleeping with the knowledge that the bell will ring, the anxiety of waking keeping you in lighter sleep stages. Then matins itself takes 60 to 90 minutes. By the time you return to your cell and settle back down, it's approaching 4 a.m. Lauds rings at first light, which in November in northern France means around 6:30 a.m. So you get maybe 2 hours of sleep after matins before you're up again. Total accumulated sleep, maybe 4 hours on a good night, possibly less, and none of it quality restorative deep sleep. Modern sleep science tells us adults need 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night for optimal health. Chronic sleep deprivation, defined as regularly getting less than 6 hours, causes cognitive impairment equivalent to significant alcohol intoxication. It weakens immune function, increases inflammation, impairs memory formation, elevates stress hormones, and over time contributes to serious health conditions including heart disease, diabetes, and mental health disorders. Medieval monks didn't know the neuroscience, but they absolutely experienced the effects. Chronicles and letters from the period mention monks falling asleep during services, struggling with focus during work, experiencing mood disturbances. Some monasteries had to implement policies about sleeping during the daytime offices because it was such a common problem. You drag yourself upright, and the cold hits like a physical blow. It's colder now than it was during matins. That pre-dawn period is typically the coldest part of the 24-hour cycle, when the earth has radiated away all of the previous day's warmth and the sun hasn't yet begun its work. Your breath comes in great white clouds. Your body is sluggish, movements slow and clumsy from the combination of cold and exhaustion. The monks are already moving in the corridor outside, their footsteps soft but audible. You join the procession, a zombie among zombies, all of you shuffling toward the chapel in darkness. There's something genuinely eerie about this pre-dawn movement through the monastery. The darkness is complete except for a few candles that create more shadows than illumination. The silence is absolute except for footfalls and breathing. Everyone moves in a kind of trance state, bodies going through motions while minds are still half asleep. This is part of the monastic discipline, learning to function even when every biological system is screaming for rest. Learning to prioritize spiritual duty over physical need. It's impressive in its way. It's also deeply, profoundly unhealthy by modern standards. The chapel is marginally warmer now, heated slightly by collective body heat from matins that hasn't fully dissipated. Marginally. We're talking maybe a 3-degree difference. Enough to notice, but not enough to matter. You take your place on the floor, that same spot you've claimed, or been assigned, or just defaulted to, and kneel. Your knees hit stone with a dull impact that sends pain shooting up your legs. They're bruised now, definitely bruised, probably showing purple-black marks that you'll discover later when you finally see yourself in daylight. Medieval monks developed permanent calluses on their knees from this constant trauma, thick pads of tissue that provided some cushioning. You don't have those calluses. You have soft modern knees that are absolutely not designed for this punishment. Lauds begins. The service follows a similar structure to Matins psalms. Readings, prayers, all in Latin, all chanted antiphonally between the abbot and the choir. The monks' voices are rougher now, scratchy from cold and sleep deprivation. Some of the older brothers are coughing, that deep, wet cough that suggests respiratory issues brewing. The young novice who was swaying during Compline looks like death warmed over, his face pale and drawn in the candlelight. He's probably 15, maybe 16, and his body is still growing, still desperately needs sleep that he's not getting. But the rule makes no exceptions for age. If you're professative, you've taken your vows, you follow the schedule. Period. Here's a thought that probably hasn't occurred to you. What happens when someone can't do this? What happens when exhaustion or illness or injury makes the schedule literally impossible to maintain? The answer varies by monastery and circumstance. Some abbots were compassionate, allowing sick monks to miss services or sleep through offices with permission. Other abbots were strict disciplinarians who viewed physical weakness as spiritual weakness and demanded absolute compliance. The rule of Benedict technically allows for infirmary care and adjusted schedules for the genuinely ill, but genuinely ill was interpreted differently in an era without modern diagnostics. You had to be visibly, obviously sick, fever, vomiting, unable to stand before you got permission to rest. Mere exhaustion didn't count. Cold didn't count. Pain didn't count. Lauds lasts about 45 minutes, shorter than Matins but still substantial. By the end, you're swaying on your knees, vision blurring slightly from the combination of sleep deprivation, cold, and sustained discomfort. The final blessing comes as an enormous relief, and you start to standingly to realize the monks aren't leaving. They're remaining in place. Of course they are, because after Lauds comes Prime, the first daylight office, and there's no point leaving the chapel just to return in 30 minutes. So you stay. Everyone stays, kneeling, standing, sitting as prescribed, but staying in this cold stone room while the first gray light of dawn begins filtering through those narrow window slits. The light is a mercy, genuinely. It's dim and gray and utterly cheerless, but it's natural light, which means no more smoke-producing candles for a few hours. The tallow flames are extinguished one by the sacristan monk in charge of the chapel and its supplies, and the air quality improves almost immediately. You can breathe without inhaling quite so much smoke. Your eyes stop watering quite so intensely. Small victories, but you take them where you can find them. Prime begins at around 7 a.m. Another round of psalms and prayers. You're well past exhausted now, entering some weird altered state where your body continues functioning but your mind has checked out. You're aware of standing and kneeling when others do, aware of the cold and the pain, but there's a distance to it, like you're piloting your body remotely rather than inhabiting it fully. This is actually a documented psychological phenomenon, dissociation as a response to chronic stress and exhaustion. Your brain is protecting itself by creating emotional and sensory distance from the experience. It's adaptive in the short term but deeply concerning as a long-term coping mechanism. Historians still argue whether medieval monks achieved mystical states during prayer or whether they were just experiencing the hallucinations and altered consciousness that come from sleep deprivation. Probably both. Honestly, there are documented accounts of monks having visions, experiencing religious ecstasy, feeling the presence of God or angels or saints. Some of these were undoubtedly genuine spiritual experiences, interpreted through the religious framework of their culture. Others were almost certainly the brain misfiring under extreme stress, creating perceptual anomalies that felt profound in the moment. When you're getting 4 hours of fragmented sleep per night for years on end, your neurotransmitter balance gets seriously weird, and weird neurotransmitters produce weird experiences. Prime concludes, and finally Finalith monks begin to disperse. But they're not going to sleep. Sleep is done for the day. You've had your 4-ish hours, and that's all you're getting until tonight. The rest of the day consists of work, meals, more prayer services, and absolutely no napping unless you want to face serious disciplinary consequences. The monks file out of the chapel heading toward their various assigned tasks. Some go to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. Some go to the scriptorium to begin copying manuscripts. Some go to the fields or workshops for manual labor. You, lacking any assigned task, follow the general flow of traffic and find yourself in the cloister as full daylight arrives. The November morning is gray and cold but beautiful in its way. Frost covers the courtyard grass, turning it silver white. Your breath still produces visible clouds, but there's something less oppressive about cold in daylight versus cold in darkness. You can see it now, can understand the source, can watch the sun weak and distant but present begin its work of warming the world. It won't warm much. November in northern France doesn't get warm. But maybe by mid-afternoon the temperature will climb into the high 40s Fahrenheit. Maybe low 50s if you're lucky. That counts as warmth by medieval standards. A bell rings, not the big church bell, but a smaller one signaling breakfast. You follow the monks toward the refectory, that communal dining hall where meals happen according to their own strict protocols. You're exhausted, you're freezing, your knees are destroyed, and you've been awake most of the night. But the schedule demands breakfast, followed by terce at 9 a.m., followed by work, followed by sext at noon, followed by more work, followed by none at 3 p.m., and on until Compline releases you to start this whole nightmarish cycle over again. There is no rest. There is no break. There is only the rule, the schedule, the endless rhythm of prayer and work that defines every moment from now until death. Remember that romantic notion of peaceful monastic life you might have had? Remember thinking this might be a calm, contemplative existence? You're learning the reality now. This isn't peaceful. This is endurance. This is a test of physical and mental limits, a deliberate program of deprivation and discipline designed to break down the self and replace it with absolute obedience to God and the rule. Some people thrived in this environment, genuinely found meaning and purpose and even joy in the structure and rigor. Most people, if we're honest, probably just survived it, enduring rather than embracing, counting down the years until their bodies gave out and they could rest permanently in the monastery cemetery. You shuffle toward breakfast, your body moving on autopilot, your mind foggy and slow. The sun is rising somewhere behind the gray November clouds. Another day is beginning. and you've got at least 16 hours of consciousness ahead of you before you're allowed to even attempt sleep again. The cold will persist. The hunger you're starting to feel will only partially be addressed by whatever thin gruel passes for breakfast. The exhaustion will compound and deepen, and that bell will keep ringing, again and again and again, dividing your life into segments of prescribed activity where personal preference and physical comfort are utterly irrelevant. Welcome to the reality of medieval monastic sleep schedules, where rest is a luxury and exhaustion is a sacrament. You're beginning to understand something fundamental about monastic life that doesn't make it into the romantic depictions. This is a military operation disguised as spiritual practice. The bells function like a drill sergeant's whistle, commanding absolute obedience. The schedule is as rigid as any army's. The consequences for failure are swift and humiliating. You don't get to negotiate with exhaustion or plead for mercy from the cold. You simply comply, or you face discipline that makes compliance seem preferable. The monks ahead of you move with that same efficient shuffle, conserving energy, their bodies trained by years of this routine to function on minimal sleep. You notice details now in the growing daylight that you missed in the darkness. Many of the older monks have a particular way of walking slow, deliberate, slightly stiff that suggests joint problems, arthritis, the accumulated damage of decades spent kneeling on stone floors in unheated buildings. The younger monks move better, but even they show signs of chronic exhaustion. Dark circles under eyes, a certain heaviness to their movements, that vacant look that comes from operating in perpetual sleep deficit. There's a hierarchy to suffering here that you're starting to perceive. The abbot, the prior, the senior monks, they get slightly better accommodations. Not much better. The rule of Benedict explicitly warns against excessive privilege, but marginally improved. They might have cells that are fractionally larger, blankets that are slightly thicker, positions during services that allow for sitting rather than kneeling. These tiny advantages compound over years to make a significant difference in quality of life. The young novices and the newest arrivals, they get the worst of everything. The coldest cells, the thinnest blankets, the hardest work assignments, the longest periods of kneeling. It's a trial by ordeal, a testing period to see who has the constitution physical and spiritualito survive long-term. You pass through the cloister and notice something you missed earlier. The stone columns are wet with condensation, moisture that's frozen into a thin layer of ice on the shaded side. The cloister is technically indoors but functionally outdoors, and in winter it becomes a wind tunnel that funnels cold air through the entire monastery. Monks walk through this space dozens of times per day, moving between chapel, refectory, dormitory, work areas. Each transit is an exposure event, a few minutes of bitter cold that never quite leaves your bones before the next exposure. The refectory door opens and you file inside, grateful for even the minimal protection of four walls and a roof. The dining hall is long and narrow, with wooden tables and benches arranged in rows. There's a raised platform at one end where the abbot and senior monks will sit, and a lectern where one monk will read from scripture during the meal. Because meals aren't just meals, heresy, another form of worship, another opportunity for discipline and instruction. The monks take their places in assigned seats, standing behind the benches, waiting for the abbot to arrive and give permission to sit. Your legs are trembling from exhaustion and the sustained abuse of the past 7 hours. You've been awake since 2 a.m. actually. You've been awake since 8 p.m. yesterday except for those brief fragmentary sleep periods, and your body is running on fumes. The idea of sitting down, even on a hard wooden bench, Sounds like paradise. But you stand because everyone else is standing, and you wait because everyone else is waiting, and you're learning that personal discomfort is utterly irrelevant to the functioning of this place. The abbot enters, followed by the prior and other senior monks. They process to the head table with ceremonial dignity, and only after they've taken their places does the abbot signal for everyone to sit. The collective sound of 30 monks sitting simultaneously on wooden benches echoes through the hall. You collapse onto your bench with significantly less grace than everyone else, and your knees scream protest at the new position. Apparently sitting after prolonged kneeling also hurts. Everything hurts. Pain is just your constant companion now. A prayer is chanted Latin, naturally, and then servers begin bringing food. You're expecting something warm, maybe porridge or bread or soup, something to combat the cold and provide energy for the long day ahead. What arrives is disappointing. A chunk of coarse dark bread, maybe 4 ounces, and a wooden bowl containing what looks like thin gruel, probably oats or barley cooked with water. No milk, no honey, no flavor whatsoever. This is breakfast. This is what you're supposed to survive on until the midday meal, which won't be much more substantial. Medieval monasteries practiced regular fasting as spiritual discipline. Depending on the liturgical calendar, there might be multiple days per week when only one meal was served, or when animal products were forbidden, or when quantities were deliberately restricted. The rule of Benedict specified that monks should receive sufficient food, but sufficient was interpreted conservatively. You weren't supposed to be hungry enough to starve, but you definitely weren't supposed to be comfortable or satisfied. Hunger, like cold and exhaustion, was a tool for focusing the mind on spiritual matters rather than bodily comfort. The meal is eaten in complete silence while one monk looks like that exhausted novice. Poor kid reads from the lectern. He's working through some dense theological text, his voice hoarse and stumbling over Latin pronunciation. No one is really listening. Everyone is focused on their bread and gruel, chewing slowly to make it last, trying to extract maximum nutrition from minimal calories. You take a bite of the bread and nearly break a tooth. It's not just coarse, it's genuinely hard, the kind of bread that's probably several days old, kept in storage and distributed regardless of condition. Medieval bread was nothing like modern bread, no commercial yeast producing consistent fluffy results, just wild fermentation that produced dense, heavy loaves that could serve double duty as building materials. The gruel is worse. It's lukewarm at best, completely flavorless, with a texture like wallpaper paste. You force it down because you're hungry and because you need calories for whatever's coming next. The monks around you eat with mechanical efficiency, spooning gruel and chewing bread without any visible emotion or reaction. This is food as fuel, nothing more. The concept of enjoying a meal, of dining as pleasure, is completely absent. The reading continues. The novice's voice is fading, exhaustion making his words slur together. He's been up as long as you have, probably longer since he had work duties before Compline last night, and he'll have more work after breakfast. This reading assignment is probably a minor punishment for some infraction, because standing at a lectern reading aloud when you're sleep-deprived and starving is its own special torture. He stumbles over a passage, restarts, stumbles again. The abbot makes a small gesture and the monk master rises, walks to the lectern, and without a word relieves the novice of his duty. The kid retreats to his seat, head down, radiating embarrassment and relief in equal measure. You finish your gruel and bread, which takes maybe 10 minutes despite eating slowly. Your stomach is still hungry, that gnawing emptiness only partially filled. You're cold, exhausted, and underfed, which means your body is going to have a very hard time regulating temperature or maintaining cognitive function. This is deliberate. Everything here is deliberate. The deprivation isn't an accident or an unfortunate byproduct of medieval technology limitations. It's the entire point. Break down the body, humble the spirit, create complete dependence on God and the community for survival. The meal concludes with another prayer, and the monks rise to begin their work assignments. The sun is fully up now, weak November light filtering through narrow windows, and you realize you've made it through your first night and early morning. You're battered, bruised, exhausted, freezing, and hungry, but you've made it. Only about 14 more waking hours until you can attempt sleep again. Only 6 more prayer services to endure today. Only about 15,000 more days if you actually committed to this life until death. The sleep deprivation is already affecting your cognition. Your thoughts are slow, muddled. You're having trouble with basic tasks like coordinating your movements or following the flow of activity around you. And this is just day 1, the very beginning. Chronic sleep deprivation accumulates. Tomorrow you'll be more exhausted than today. The day after, worse still. Eventually you reach some kind of equilibrium where you're perpetually operating at maybe 60% cognitive capacity, which becomes your new normal. Medieval monks just lived like this for years. For decades, because the alternative was leaving, which meant abandoning your vows, facing social ostracism, possibly eternal damnation. The physical suffering was temporary, it ended with death. The spiritual consequences of breaking your vows were eternal. That calculation kept men in monasteries through circumstances that would break most modern humans in days. Work begins after terce, the third canonical hour at 9 a.m., and you discover that rest isn't even conceptually part of the monastic vocabulary. Your wooden plank bed isn't a place for recuperation, it's just the horizontal surface where you park your body during the brief intervals between services. The real monastic life happens during these work periods, these stretches of manual labor that fill the gaps between prayer services like mortar between stones. The monk master assigns you to the newest, most physically demanding, and least desirable tasks available, because that's how monasteries work. You're not here to be comfortable. You're here to learn humility through exhaustion, obedience through servitude, and spiritual growth through physical suffering that makes medieval peasant labor look appealing by comparison. Your first assignment is hauling water. The monastery has a well in the central courtyard, a deep stone shaft that descends maybe 40 feet to reach the water table, and every drop of water used in this place has to be pulled up by hand, 1 bucket at a time, using a rope and windlass system that's probably older than anyone currently living here. The kitchen needs water for cooking. The lavatorium needs water for hand washing before meals. The laundry needs water for the occasional washing of linens. The infirmary needs water for the sick. The requirements are endless, and you're one of several brothers assigned to meet them. The bucket is wooden, reinforced with iron bands, and holds maybe 2 gallons when full. 2 gallons of water weighs approximately 16 pounds, and you're going to be lifting that weight 40 feet vertically using a windlass and rope system that has all the mechanical advantage of a slightly sophisticated pulley. Your muscles, softened by modern sedentary living, are going to discover exactly how inadequate they are for medieval manual labor. You grip the windlass handle sworn smooth by centuries of hands, and begin cranking the bucket upward from the dark depths below. The first few rotations are manageable. The bucket is ascending, water is sloshing, you're making progress. Then your shoulders start burning. Then your back joins in. By the time the bucket reaches the top, your entire upper body is screaming and you're breathing hard from exertion that medieval people would consider light exercise. You haul the bucket over the stone rim of the well, water sloshing dangerously close to the edge, and carry it one-handed, because there's no way you're managing this one-handed tower, the kitchen building 50 yards away across the courtyard. The courtyard is fully exposed to November wind, which is now picking up with the morning sun. The wind isn't warming, it's just moving cold air around more efficiently, finding its way through your inadequate clothing and stealing what little body heat you've managed to generate. Your hands on the bucket handles are going numb, that pins and needles sensation announcing that your circulation is not handling this situation well. The water in the bucket is cold enough that you can see your breath condensing above it, and you're suddenly very aware that if you're cold now, you're going to be much colder in about 2 minutes when water inevitably sloshes onto your clothes. Medieval people were constantly wet. That's one of those obvious in hindsight facts that modern people never consider. No waterproof fabrics existed. No Gore-Tex. No synthetic materials. No rubber. When it rained, you got wet. When you worked with water, you got wet. When you sweated through physical labor, you got wet. And in cold weather, being wet was genuinely dangerous. Wet fabric conducts heat away from your body far more efficiently than dry fabric, creating a fast track to hypothermia. Medieval wool had some water-resistant properties from the natural lanolin content, but it wasn't waterproof. Once saturated, wool stayed wet for hours, sometimes days, and you just wore it anyway, because you probably only owned 1 or 2 sets of clothing total, and changing wasn't an option if your only alternative was also wet. You reach the kitchen and deposit the bucket near the massive stone fireplace where cooking happens. A monk, the kitchener, the brother responsible for meal preparation, nods acknowledgement without speaking. The great silence has ended after breakfast. Technically, but unnecessary speech is still discouraged. You're allowed to speak for practical purposes related to work, but casual conversation remains forbidden. You trudge back toward the well for bucket number 2. The kitchener mentioned needing 20 buckets this morning. 20. You've done 1. By bucket number 5, your hands are developing blisters. The windlass handles are smooth but not gentle, and the repetitive gripping and twisting motion is creating friction points that your soft modern palms cannot handle. You can feel the hot spots forming, that precursor sensation before skin starts separating into fluid-filled bubbles. Medieval monks developed thick calluses that protected against this, but you don't have calluses. You have office hands, or student hands, or whatever modern equivalent of minimally worked hands you brought to this place. They're betraying you spectacularly. By bucket number 10, those hot spots are definitely blisters, and a couple have burst, leaving raw patches that burn with every subsequent grip. You're trying to adjust your hand position to avoid the worst spots, but there's no comfortable way to crank a windlass when your palms are essentially open wounds. The other monks working the well, 2 brothers assigned to the same task, notice your struggle but don't offer sympathy or help. This is your trial, your test. Either you push through the pain or you demonstrate that you're not suited for monastic life. There's no middle ground, no accommodation for suffering that falls short of actual physical collapse. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Manual labor was considered spiritually essential in Benedictine monasticism. Saint Benedict's famous motto was, ora et labora, pray and work. The idea was that physical labor humbled the spirit, prevented idleness, which Benedict called the enemy of the soul, and created self-sufficiency so monasteries didn't have to depend entirely on outside donations. Monks weren't just praying all day. They were farming, building, cooking, brewing, copying manuscripts, maintaining infrastructure. A functioning monastery was essentially a self-contained village, producing most of what it needed through the labor of its inhabitants. And everyone worked, from the newest novice to the oldest monk, with only the severely ill or disabled exempted. Bucket 15 arrives, and you're operating on pure stubbornness. Your shoulders feel like they're separating from your body. Your back is in spasm. Your hands are bleeding, actually bleeding, thin lines of red mixing with the water sloshing in the bucket. Your legs are trembling from exhaustion and the accumulated trauma of the past 12 hours. And you've got 5 more buckets to go before you can move on to whatever fresh hell the monk master has planned for your afternoon. The Benedictine rule specified that work should be balanced with prayer, rest, and study, creating a holistic rhythm that sustained both body and soul. In practice, interpretations varied wildly. Some monasteries were relatively lenient, assigning work in reasonable quantities with adequate rest periods. Others, like this one, apparently interpreted labor as punishing physical exertion that leaves you too exhausted to think about anything except collapsing. You're definitely in the latter category. The monk master is testing you, pushing you to see where you break, assessing whether you have the physical and mental fortitude to survive long-term. Bucket 20 finally, mercifully completes. You set it down in the kitchen with hands that can barely maintain their grip, and the kitchener inspects your palms with a critical eye. He makes a gesture toward a small clay pot on a shelf, some kind of salve, probably animal fat mixed with herbs, and you understand you're permitted to treat your wounds. The salve is greasy and stings when applied, but it creates a barrier between raw flesh and the next task, which you're certain is coming immediately because rest is not how this place operates. The monk master appears, because of course he does, materializing with that unsettling silent efficiency that medieval monks seem to perfect. He surveys your blistered hands, your exhausted posture, your obvious distress, and his expression reveals absolutely nothing. He points toward the stable area. Yes, this monastery maintains horses, probably for the abbot's travel and transporting supplies, and you understand that you're being reassigned. Wonderful. From water hauling to stable work, which definitely won't involve any additional hand-intensive labor that will aggravate your fresh wounds. Definitely not. The stable is marginally warmer than the courtyard, heated by horse body heat and the fermentation of manure in the stalls. It smells exactly like you'd expect a medieval stable to smell. A thick, organic miasma of horse sweat, urine-soaked straw, fermenting waste, and that particular dusty hay smell that coats your throat and makes you cough. There are 4 horses here, sturdy working animals rather than elegant riding horses, and they need mucking out, which means you're shoveling manure. Of course you are. The shovel is wooden with an iron edge, heavy and awkward, and your blistered hands hate it immediately. The stalls haven't been cleaned in several days. Waste management happened on a rotating schedule. Not daily, so there's a substantial accumulation of manure mixed with soiled straw. You're supposed to shovel this mixture into a wooden cart. Wheel the cart to the monastery's midden heap, a polite term for the giant pile of decomposing organic waste behind the agricultural buildings. Dump it and repeat until all 4 stalls are clean and rebedded with fresh straw. Your quirky historical tidbit. Medieval people were intensely interested in manure. Not for sanitary reasons, the concept of bacteria and disease transmission was unknown, but for agricultural ones. Animal waste was precious fertilizer, essential for maintaining soil fertility in an era before industrial agriculture and synthetic nutrients. Monasteries carefully managed their manure production, composting it in organized heaps where it would break down into rich fertilizer for the vegetable gardens and fields. Monks debated the relative merits of different animals. Waste horse manure was hot and broke down quickly. Cow manure was cool and worked better for certain crops. Entire sections of agricultural treatises were devoted to manure management. So while you're shoveling horse poop and questioning every decision that led to this moment, you're actually handling a substance that medieval people considered valuable and scientifically interesting. The work is backbreaking. Literally. Each shovelful weighs maybe 10 pounds, and you're lifting it from ground level up to the cart, then walking to the midden, lifting again to overturn the cart, then walking back. Your lower back begins screaming somewhere around the 10th shovelful. By the 20th, you're legitimately concerned you're causing permanent injury. By the 40th, you've transcended concern and entered a zen-like state where pain is just information and you've decided to ignore information. The horses watch you with those large, vaguely judgmental horse eyes, occasionally snorting or stamping. Medieval horses were smaller and sturdier than modern breeds, closer to what we'd call ponies today, bred for endurance and work rather than speed or size. They were well adapted to limited feed and rough conditions, which was fortunate because monastery horses didn't exactly live in luxury. They got basic care, adequate feed, and work assignments that modern animal welfare advocates would find problematic. But they were valuable assets, worth significant money, so they couldn't be completely neglected either. Midday arrives, announced by the bell for sext, the 6th hour. You abandon your shovel gratefully, desperately, and join the procession to the chapel. More standing, more kneeling, more Latin psalms you don't understand. Your body is one continuous ache now. No single injury or pain standing out because everything hurts equally. Your hands throb, your back spasms, your knees, abused during the night services and given no recovery time, protest every movement. You're filthy from stable work, smelling of horse manure and sweat, and you'll stay this way because bathing isn't a daily activity. It's not even a weekly activity. We'll get to that horror later. Sext concludes, and you're dismissed to the refectory for the midday meal. This is the main meal of the day, the one where you might actually receive enough calories to partially compensate for the brutal physical labor. The meal consists of more bread, marginally fresher than breakfast, but still aggressively medieval in its density, a thin vegetable stew containing unidentifiable roots and greens, and a small portion of cheese. That's it. No meat, because today isn't a feast day and regular days only permit fish or dairy at best. The stew is warm, which is the kindest thing you can say about it. It's also undersalted, underseasoned, and contains vegetables that have been stored since last harvest, meaning they're on the edge of spoilage and taste like it. You eat because your body desperately needs fuel. The monks around you eat with that same mechanical efficiency, shoveling food without apparent enjoyment or disgust, just consuming adequate calories to continue functioning. The reader at the lectern, a different monk this time. An older brother with a surprisingly pleasant voice works through a religious text while everyone chews. No one talks. No one makes eye contact. It's communal eating in the most literal sense, same time, same place, same food, but there's nothing social about it. It's fuel distribution, nothing more. After the meal comes none. The 9th hour, another brief service at 3 p.m., then back to work. You return to the stables to finish mucking out, and by the time you're done, the sun is already setting. November days are short this far north, maybe 9 hours of daylight, and you've burned through most of them hauling water and shoveling manure. Your body is beyond exhausted now, entering some realm of depletion where you're moving through sheer force of will because your actual physical resources are tapped out. Vespers rings at sunset, pulling you back to the chapel for yet another service. Then Compline, then the cell, the wooden plank, the thin blanket, the cycle beginning again. And tomorrow, it all repeats. Different tasks, maybe, but the same brutal combination of inadequate sleep, insufficient food, punishing physical labor, and constant cold. This is monastic life stripped of all romantic illusion. This is the reality that most people couldn't survive, and that those who did survive often didn't entirely thrive within. Just endured until their bodies gave out and the monastery cemetery received another permanent resident. Your hands throb as you lie on your plank bed. Your back spasms. Your knees ache. You're hungry despite 2 meals. You're exhausted despite lying down. And in a few hours, that bell will ring for matins, and you'll haul yourself upright and do it all over again. Welcome to medieval monastic labor, where rest is weakness and suffering is sacrament. The eating silence is its own special psychological torture, and you don't fully appreciate it until you're sitting in the refectory for your 3rd or 4th meal, staring at bland food you can't even complain about because speaking is forbidden. Humans are social creatures. We bond over meals. We use food as a focal point for conversation, storytelling, connection. Strip away the talking and you're left with the mechanical act of chewing and swallowing, the utilitarian consumption of nutrients, and a profound sense of isolation despite being surrounded by dozens of people doing exactly the same thing you are. The rule of Benedict is explicit about meals. They happen in silence except for the designated reader, whose voice provides spiritual nourishment while bodies receive physical sustenance. The reasoning is straightforward. Meals are another opportunity for instruction, another moment when monks can absorb scripture and theological teaching rather than wasting time on idle chatter. Conversation distracts from contemplation. Laughter distracts from reverence. Better to maintain silence, to focus inward, to use even this basic biological necessity as a chance for spiritual development. In practice, this means you eat while listening to Latin texts you barely understand, read by monks whose voices range from surprisingly melodious to aggressively monotone depending on who drew reading duty that day. The content is usually religious Bible passages, saints' lives, theological treatises, monastic rules, but occasionally includes other educational material deemed appropriate. The reader stands at a lectern position so everyone can hear, and he reads for the entire duration of the meal, which typically lasts 20 to 30 minutes depending on the food's complexity and quantity. Since there's minimal food and it requires minimal preparation, most meals clock in around 20 minutes start to finish. You're not allowed to talk, but you are allowed to communicate essential needs through a complex system of hand signals that medieval monasteries developed specifically for this purpose. Need salt? There's a gesture for that, pinching fingers together and making a sprinkling motion. Need more bread? Point at the bread basket and make a pulling motion toward yourself. Need water? Point at your cup and make a pouring gesture. The signals are logical enough that you can puzzle some out through context. But there are dozens of them covering every conceivable dining need, and you don't know most of them yet. So you sit there, thirsty or needing something, unable to ask verbally, trying to figure out the correct hand signal while everyone else eats with practiced efficiency. Here's where it gets psychologically challenging. You can't even make sounds of satisfaction or displeasure. No appreciative when something tastes decent. No grunt of frustration when you bite into a particularly rock-hard piece of bread. No sigh of relief when you finally swallow something unpleasant. Every sound you make is a violation of the silence, a distraction from the reading, a sign that you're focused on bodily sensations rather than spiritual matters. The monks around you have mastered completely silent eating. They chew without noise, swallow without sound, manipulate utensils without clinks or scrapes. You, however, sound like a one-person percussion section. Every time your wooden spoon hits the side of your bowl, every time you chew something particularly crunchy, every accidental swallow that's louder than a whisper, you're announcing your incompetence to the entire refectory. The monk master sits at a position where he can observe everyone, and he definitely notices your acoustic violations. He's making mental notes, cataloging your failures, preparing whatever additional penances or corrections he'll assign later. This isn't paranoia, that's literally his job. The monk master is responsible for discipline, for ensuring that everyone adheres to the rule, for identifying and correcting departures from proper behavior. Your noisy eating is on his list now, along with your inadequate genuflection during services, your visible shivering that suggests weakness of will, your blistered hands that suggest insufficient calluses and therefore insufficient prior labor. You're a walking collection of deficiencies that need correction. Let's talk about the food itself, because the silence would be more bearable if what you were eating in silence was actually good. Medieval monastic cuisine was governed by the rule of Benedict, which specified that monks should receive adequate nutrition but should avoid meat from four-legged animals except in cases of illness. This created a dietary framework that was heavily vegetarian with occasional fish, dairy, and eggs depending on the liturgical calendar and the monastery's interpretation of the rules. Your typical day's food intake looks something like this. Breakfast is bread and gruel, maybe 400 to 500 calories total. The midday meal, the main meal, consists of bread, a vegetable stew or pottage, possibly some cheese or fish if it's available, maybe some fruit or nuts if it's harvest season. That's perhaps 800 to 1,000 calories if you're lucky. Supper, served after Vespers, is usually just bread and perhaps some leftover pottage. Another 300 to 400 calories. Total daily intake, somewhere between 600 to 2,000 calories. And that's on a good day when supplies are adequate and the kitchener isn't being stingy. Now consider that you're burning significantly more than that through your labor. Hauling water, mucking stables, walking constantly between services, maintaining body temperature in a cold environment, all of that requires energy. Modern nutritional science suggests that someone engaged in heavy physical labor in cold conditions might need 3,000 to 4,000 calories per day to maintain weight and energy levels. You're getting maybe half that. The result is chronic caloric deficit, which means your body is slowly consuming itself, burning muscle mass and fat stores to make up the difference. Medieval monks were often thin, not athletic thin, but gaunt thin, the kind of thin that comes from sustained undernutrition. The food quality doesn't help. That bread you're eating? It's made from whatever grain the monastery grows or can afford to buy, ground in a mill that doesn't remove all the grit and stones from the final flour. Biting down on a piece of medieval bread sometimes means encountering a small stone fragment that hasn't been fully screened out, which is why medieval people had such terrible dental health even beyond the usual period problems with tooth decay. The bread is also dense and dry, designed to last for days without spoiling, which means it's often stale by the time you eat it. You're supposed to soften it in your soup or pottage, turning it into a soggy mass that's easier to chew and swallow. The potagethet thick stew that appears at most mealsis made from whatever vegetables are available, which in November means mostly storage crops. Turnips, parsnips, onions, cabbage, maybe some dried peas or beans. These are boiled together with water and maybe some herbs from the monastery garden, creating a dish that's nutritionally adequate but gastronomically dismal. Medieval people didn't have the global spice access that we do. No black pepper unless the monastery was wealthy enough to import it. No exotic spices from Asia unless you had serious money. You had local herb sage, thyme, parsley and salt if you were lucky. That's your entire flavor palette. Salt was actually a significant expense and status marker. Producing salt through evaporation of seawater or mining rock salt deposits was labor-intensive and costly, which made salt expensive enough that it was carefully rationed. Monasteries usually had access to some salt for preserving food and basic seasoning, but it wasn't used liberally. Your pottage is undersalted by modern standards, and you can't just add more because the communal salt cellar is controlled by the servers who distribute it according to established portions. You eat what you're given at the seasoning level you're given, and you're supposed to be grateful for it because at least you're eating, which is more than many medieval peasants could guarantee every day. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually enjoyed their food or whether they just ate it because the alternative was starvation. Certainly, feast days were celebrated partly because they meant better food meat, white bread made from sifted flour, sweetened dishes with honey, maybe even some imported delicacies if the monastery had wealthy patrons. The contrast between feast day meals and regular meals was stark enough that people genuinely looked forward to the eating aspect of religious celebrations. But on regular days, on these endless succession of ordinary November days, food was fuel and nothing more. You're experiencing this firsthand as you force down today's pottage, which tastes like someone boiled vegetables in water and forgot to add anything resembling flavor. The texture is mushy, the vegetables cooked until they've lost any structural integrity. The broth is thin and gray, with a few globules of fat floating on the surface from some mystery source. Maybe the cooking pot isn't cleaned thoroughly. Maybe there's some dairy or fish oil in the recipe. You can't tell and probably don't want to know. You eat because you're hungry, because your body needs the calories, because refusing food is a sign of dangerous pride or potential spiritual crisis that will bring the monk master's attention down on you even more intensely. The reader continues his monotone delivery of whatever text he's working through. You catch occasional Latin words you recognize: Deus, God; Pater, Father; Sanctus, Holy, but the overall meaning escapes you. It might as well be white noise, a droning background that fills the silence without providing actual content to anyone who doesn't speak fluent Latin, which is most people, even in monasteries. Many monks knew enough liturgical Latin to follow services and read prayers, but genuine fluency was rarer. The educated monks, those who'd come from wealthy families or had been trained as oblates from childhood, could understand the readings. Everyone else just sat there in silence. chewing flavorless food and listening to incomprehensible words and accepting this as normal. There's a special kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people but completely isolated from connection. No conversation. No eye contact beyond brief practical glances. No laughter or shared jokes or any of the social bonding that makes humans feel like they're part of a community rather than just individual organisms occupying the same space. You're learning that monasteries are communal in structure but deeply isolating in experience. You live with these men, eat with them, pray with them, work alongside them, and yet you know nothing about them. Their names, maybe, if you've picked those up from context. Their roles: abbot, prior, monk master, Kitchener. But their thoughts, their feelings, their personalities, completely unknown. The silence erases individuality, transforms 30 distinct human beings into 30 identical nodes in a ritual machine. A younger monk, maybe mid-20s, still has some vitality in his movements, accidentally knocks his wooden bowl off the table. It hits the stone floor with a crack that sounds thunderous in the silence, rolling a few inches before stopping. The entire refectory goes still. The reader pauses mid-sentence. Every head turns toward the source of the noise. The young monk's face flushes red with embarrassment and shame. He kneels beside his seat not to retrieve the bowl, but as an immediate act of penance for the disturbance. He'll stay kneeling there for the rest of the meal, public humiliation for a minor accident, a reminder that even unintentional violations of the silence and order are infractions requiring atonement. You make a mental note: don't drop anything, don't make noise, don't draw attention. The consequences aren't severe by modern standards, not being beaten or imprisoned for knocking over a bowl, but the public shaming, the enforced penance, the communal attention focused on your failure. That's its own kind of punishment. Medieval monasteries ran on shame and honor systems. Doing well meant you were essentially invisible, functioning smoothly within the system. Failing meant you were noticed, marked, singled out for correction. And correction was always public, always designed to reinforce communal standards through individual humiliation. The meal continues. You finish your pottage, sop up the last traces with a piece of bread that's only slightly softer than wood, and sit with your hands folded in your lap while others finish. You can't leave until everyone is done and the abbot signals the concluding prayer. So you wait, stomach still hungry despite eating everything you were given, listening to Latin words you don't understand, surrounded by silent men whose inner lives are completely opaque to you. This is communion in the most technical sense, common union. Shared experience, but it feels like the opposite of connection. It feels like organized loneliness, like systematic isolation dressed up as community. The abbot finally signals. Everyone rises. Prayer is chanted. The reader closes his book. The monks file out in order of seniority, heading toward their next obligation: work, prayer, study, whatever the schedule demands. You're learning that there's never unstructured time, never a moment where you can just exist without purpose or direction. Every minute is assigned. Every hour has its designated activity. From rising until sleep, and even sleep is interrupted for midnight prayers. The schedule is the structure, and the structure is absolute. You leave the refectory still hungry, still cold, still exhausted. The silence continues outside the milieu between services, so the great silence isn't in effect. But unnecessary speech is still discouraged, so most monks maintain quiet. You could theoretically speak now, could try to engage one of these men in conversation, But the culture is so thoroughly against it that you don't even try. You've absorbed the lesson. Silence is normal. Speech is deviation. Keep your thoughts to yourself. Keep your reactions internal. Become a smooth, quiet, efficient component of the monastic machine. Your next obligation is work. More labor in whatever assignment the monk master designates. Your hands are still blistered, your back is still screaming, and you're facing another several hours of physical exertion before Vespers and then Compline, and then the whole cycle starts over. But at least you've eaten. At least you've consumed something, even if it was barely adequate and thoroughly unenjoyable. At least your body has some fuel, however insufficient, to burn through the coming hours. Welcome to medieval monastic dining, where food is fuel, silence is law, and every meal is another opportunity to reinforce that your needs for nourishment, for connection, for pleasure are entirely irrelevant compared to the spiritual discipline of absolute submission to the rule. The communal salt cellar sits at the head table, a small wooden box that represents more than just seasoning. Salt was wealth. Salt was power. Salt was the difference between food that lasted through winter and food that rotted away. Monasteries that controlled salt sources, coastal houses with access to salt pans, or properties near salt mines had genuine economic leverage. They could trade salt for other necessities, preserve fish and meat for lean months, season their food adequately. Poorer monasteries rationed salt carefully, using it primarily for preservation and barely at all for taste. You're definitely in the latter category. Every meal is a reminder that flavor is luxury, seasoning is privilege, and your tongue's preferences are utterly unimportant. There's also the matter of what you're not eating. The rule of Benedict forbade meat from four-legged animals, cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, for all monks except the genuinely sick. The reasoning was partly theological. Animals that walk on all fours were considered somehow more earthly, more corrupting, and partly practical. Meat was expensive, and eating it regularly would strain monastery resources. But the rule created interesting loopholes that medieval monks exploited with impressive creativity. Birds weren't four-legged, so poultry was sometimes permitted. Fish obviously weren't four-legged, so fish was fine. And here's the quirky part. Beaver tails were classified as fish by some medieval church authorities because beavers spent so much time in water. So technically, in some monasteries, you could eat beaver tail and remain compliant with the rule. Medieval logic at its finest. Your monastery doesn't serve beaver tail, obviously, or much fish for that matter, given that you're landlocked and transportation of fresh fish is difficult without modern refrigeration. What you get is dairy cheese, occasionally milk, sometimes eggs, and endless variations on vegetable pottage. The repetition is mind-numbing. Same basic meal structure every single day, with only minor variations based on what's available from storage or the gardens. In summer and early autumn, you might get fresh vegetables and fruits, which would be a genuine improvement. In late autumn and winter, you get storage crops that are increasingly old and tired as the season progresses. By late February or March, before the new growing season produces anything edible, monasteries faced the hunger gap, a period when stored food was depleted or spoiling and fresh food wasn't yet available. Meals got even sparser, even less appetizing, and monks genuinely went hungry. The young monk is still kneeling beside his seat, his dropped bowl a few feet away where it fell. No one has retrieved it. No one has acknowledged him beyond the initial attention when it happened. He'll stay there until the next meal or until the monk master specifically releases him from penance, whichever comes first. His knees on that stone floor, his stomach still hungry because he didn't finish his meal, his face burning with shame. You'll learn, watching this, that every action has consequences here, that the system is designed to catch and correct deviations, that your goal is to become so thoroughly compliant that you never stand out, never get noticed, never become the focus of corrective attention. You file out with the others, your stomach still complaining about the inadequate meal, your mouth tasting like bland vegetables and regret. The next meal is hours away. Supper after Vespersand, it will be even smaller than this one. Just bread and maybe some leftover pottage. You're supposed to function through the afternoon on what you've just consumed, supposed to work and pray and maintain focus despite being chronically underfed. And somehow, impossibly, medieval monks did this. They adapted. Their metabolisms slowed to match available calories. Their expectations adjusted to match reality. Or they didn't adapt, and they got sick, or weak, or died younger than they might have otherwise. The monastery cemetery doesn't distinguish between those who thrived and those who merely survived until they couldn't anymore. The silence continues as you walk, as you move toward your next obligation. Your stomach gurgles quietly, a sound that feels embarrassingly loud in the quiet corridor. No one reacts. Either they didn't hear or they're too polite to acknowledge your body's protest. You're learning to be invisible, to be silent, to be a perfectly obedient component of a system that values uniformity above all else. And with every meal, every silent chewing session, every moment of isolated communal eating, that lesson sinks deeper into your bones. You are not an individual here. You are a monk, one of many, interchangeable, silent, hungry, and that's exactly how it's supposed to be. The afternoon work assignment is manuscript copying, which sounds infinitely better than hauling water or mucking stables until you actually sit down in the scriptorium and realize that medieval scribal work is its own uniquely torturous experience. The scriptorium is a long, narrow room with high windows designed to capture maximum daylight, absolutely essential because you're working with tiny letters on expensive parchment and you need every photon you can get. The windows are those same narrow slits you've seen throughout the monastery, which means maximum daylight is still pretty dim by modern standards, especially on an overcast November afternoon when the sun is already low and weak. Your workspace is a slanted desk, essentially a wooden board tilted at about a 45-degree angle with a small shelf underneath for storing materials. You're given a piece of parchment, a quill pen, a small pot of iron gall ink, and an exemplar text to copy. The monk master explains your task in brief, clipped Latin that you mostly understand through context and gestures. Copy this page, letter by letter, exactly as it appears. No errors, no variations, perfect reproduction. Then he leaves you to it, moving on to supervise other brothers engaged in similar work throughout the scriptorium. Parchment is animal skin, usually sheep, goat, or calf that's been scraped, stretched, dried, and treated until it becomes a smooth, durable writing surface. It's expensive, ridiculously expensive. A single sheet represents hours of labor and the death of an animal, which means errors are not acceptable. If you make a mistake, you can sometimes scrape away the ink with a knife and try again. But too much scraping damages the parchment and creates thin spots that might tear. Serious errors mean the entire sheet is ruined, representing significant wasted resources. No pressure. The quill pen is exactly what it sounds like, a large feather, probably from a goose, with the end cut at a sharp angle to create a writing nib. You've never used a quill pen in your life. Why would you? Ballpoint pens exist. Pencils exist. Keyboards exist. But here, now, you're holding this feather and trying to figure out how to coax writing from it. The nib needs to be dipped in ink. Regular light holds may be enough for a few letters before running dry, and the angle of the pen, the pressure you apply, the speed of your strokes, all of it matters. Too much pressure and you scratch the parchment or create blobs of ink. Too little pressure and nothing transfers. The angle needs to be consistent or your letters will be uneven. It's an entire skill set that scribes spent years perfecting, and you're expected to produce acceptable work right now, today, with zero training. Your first attempt at writing a letter capital D to start the sentence you're copying just a disaster. The ink blobs, spreading in an ugly puddle that immediately soaks into the parchment. You try to blot it with a cloth provided for this purpose, but the damage is done. The letter is ruined. The parchment has a dark stain, and you failed within literally the first 5 seconds of this task. Several monks working nearby glance over at the commotion, your whispered curse. The sound of frantic blotting, and their expressions range from sympathy to barely concealed disdain. The scriptorium has a culture, clearly, and you're violating it by being incompetent. You scrape away the blob with a small knife, carefully removing the top layer of parchment to eliminate the stain. The surface is now thinner, slightly rougher, more prone to problems, but usable. You try again, this time with less ink on the nib, lighter pressure, more careful control. The result is better, not good, but better. The letter is legible, if shaky and uneven. You proceed to the next letter, then the next, slowly working your way through the first word. It takes you approximately 10 minutes to write 6 letters. At this rate, you'll complete maybe 1 page in an entire afternoon, and it will look terrible. The work of someone who has no business touching valuable parchment. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval manuscripts were astonishingly labor-intensive to produce. A single Bible might require 200 animal skins for the parchment, months or years of scribal labor to copy the text, additional time for illumination and decoration if it was a fancy edition, and then binding. The result was a book that cost as much as a house. Literally, books were wealth. Monasteries that maintained scriptoria and produced manuscripts were performing economic activity as much as spiritual work, creating products that could be sold or traded or gifted to wealthy patrons in exchange for donations. The careful, perfect copying you're attempting and failing at represented actual monetary value. The monks working around you demonstrate what skilled scribal work looks like. Their hands move with fluid confidence, quills gliding across parchment in smooth, even strokes. Their letters are uniform in size and spacing, their lines straight without needing guide marks. They work in silence, naturally, because this is a monastery and unnecessary speech is always forbidden. But there's an intensity to their concentration that creates its own kind of communication. These men are craftsmen, artists, creating beautiful objects through painstaking labor. You are a disaster with a feather, creating ugly smudges through incompetent fumbling. The cold is a factor here too, though you didn't initially realize it. Your hands need to be nimble and precise for this work, but they're stiff from cold and from the blisters and cuts you sustained during morning labor. The scriptorium has no heat source. Fire near valuable manuscripts would be insaniso. It's the same ambient near freezing temperature as everywhere else in the monastery. Your fingers don't want to cooperate, don't want to maintain the fine motor control necessary for tiny letters. Medieval scribes worked through this constantly, developing techniques like tucking one hand inside their robe to warm it while writing with the other, then switching. Some wealthy monasteries provided fingerless gloves for scribes, but yours apparently doesn't believe in such luxury. The light is failing. November afternoon means you've got maybe another 2 hours of usable daylight, and it's getting dimmer by the minute. You're squinting at your exemplar text, straining to distinguish individual letters, holding your work up to the window to check your progress. The monks around you continue working with no apparent difficulty, their eyes adjusted to low light, their muscle memory carrying them through familiar letter forms even when they can't see perfectly. You're struggling, making errors, scratching them out, trying again, accumulating a parchment that's increasingly scarred and damaged from your corrections. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Medieval scribes left complaints in the margins of the manuscripts they were copying. "Thank God it's almost night," appears in several medieval texts. "Oh, my hand" shows up in others. "The parchment is hairy" was a complaint about poor quality writing surfaces. "Now I've written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink" appears at the end of several manuscripts. These marginal notes, called colophons when they appear at the end of texts, give us glimpses of the human beings behind the beautiful lettering. Tired, cold, cramped, desperate for the day's work to end. Your experience is nothing new. Scribes have been suffering through this for centuries, and they coped partly by leaving little messages for future readers. Tiny rebellions against the perfect, impersonal copying they were supposed to perform. Your back is cramping from hunching over the slanted desk. The position is accordiere, standing or sitting on a stool that's too low, bent forward to see the work, neck craned, shoulders tense. Medieval scribes developed chronic back problems, spinal curvature, vision issues. It was considered a sedentary, safe occupation compared to manual labor, but it came with its own catalog of health problems that would disable men by their 40s or 50s. The constant close work in poor light damaged eyes. The repetitive hand movements caused what we'd now call repetitive stress injuries. The hunched posture created permanent spinal issues. You're getting a preview of all this in just a few hours, your body screaming protest at the unnatural position and repetitive motions. The bell rings for none. The afternoon prayer service at 3 p.m. You're actually grateful for the interruption, for permission to stop butchering this innocent piece of parchment. You set down your quill, clean the nib carefully as you've seen others do, cover your ink pot, and file out with the other scribes toward the chapel. Your page is maybe 1/3 complete, and its ugly letters of uneven size, spacing inconsistent, several obvious corrections visible. The brother working next to you has completed 3 full pages in the same time period, each one immaculate. You're not just slow, you're incompetent, and everyone knows it. None is brief, maybe 20 minutes of psalms and prayers. Then back to the scriptorium for the final hour or 2 of workable light. You return to your desk, uncover your ink, pick up your quill, and continue the slow, painful process of copying text letter by letter. The exemplar you're working from is beautifully clear, obviously copied by a master scribe. Each letter perfect, which makes your crude reproduction feel even more inadequate by comparison. You're defacing the beauty of the original with your incompetent echo of it. The monk working next to you, an older brother with ink-stained fingers and a permanent squint, leans over slightly and makes a small gesture, a subtle correction to how you're holding the quill. His advice is given silently, through demonstration rather than words. But you understand. Adjust your grip. Change the angle slightly. Let the pen do more of the work rather than forcing it. You try his suggestion and the next few letters come out marginally better. Not good, but less terrible. He nods slightly and returns to his own work. And you realize you've just experienced medieval teaching methodology observation. Minimal intervention. Learning through doing and failing until you gradually fail less. The light is definitely going now. The windows admitting only the grayest twilight. Candles begin appearing in the scriptorium, lit by brothers who've finished their pages and are transitioning to evening duties. Remember those tallow candles we discussed? They're back, and they're filling the scriptorium with that same greasy smoke you've come to know and loathe. But without them, you can't work, so you accept the smoke as necessary evil. A candle is placed near your desk, and you continue copying by its flickering, inadequate light, squinting harder, moving your face closer to the parchment to see clearly, absorbing more smoke with every breath. Vespers bell rings, sunset prayers, and you're released from scribal torture. Your page is maybe 2/3 complete, and it's awful. A monument to incompetence that will probably be scraped clean and reused because it's certainly not acceptable as a finished product. You file toward the chapel with the others, and the monk master intercepts you briefly in the corridor. He's examined your work-off course he has, and his expression tells you everything. You'll be returning to the scriptorium tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until you learn the skill properly, until your letters are acceptable, until you can contribute rather than just waste valuable resources. This is your new assignment, your penance and your education combined, and you'll continue until you succeed or until you break and leave. The evening services Vespers and then Complimbler together in your exhausted mind. More standing, more kneeling, more Latin psalms. Your body is a catalog of complaints. Blistered hands, cramped back, aching knees, strained eyes, smoke-irritated lungs. The supper that follows Vespers is even more meager than usual. Just bread and some watered-down ale that tastes like sour despair. Then Compline, the final service, and finally permission to collapse on your wooden plank in your freezing cell for a few inadequate hours of sleep before matins rips you back to consciousness. You lie there in the darkness, hands throbbing, back spasming, eyes burning from strain and smoke. Tomorrow you'll return to that scriptorium, to that slanted desk, to that quill pen that hates you and that parchment you're slowly destroying. You'll spend hours hunched over tiny letters, breathing smoke, straining your eyes, failing to meet the standards that every other monk seems to achieve effortlessly. And this is considered light work, indoor work, the kind of assignment that monks with educational backgrounds get as a privilege. The alternative is fields and stables and endless manual labor. So you're supposed to be grateful. You're supposed to appreciate this opportunity to ruin your back and eyes in the service of manuscript production. Welcome to medieval monastic labor division, where every job is terrible in its own special way, and the best you can hope for is finding which flavor of suffering suits you least poorly. Sleep now, while you can. The bell will ring soon enough, and this whole miserable cycle begins again. The iron gall ink you're using is made from, and this is genuinely medieval chemistry, iron salts and tannic acids extracted from oak galls, those weird ball-shaped growths that form on oak trees when wasps lay eggs in them. The galls are crushed, soaked in water or wine to extract the tannins, then mixed with iron sulfate, called vitriol in medieval terms, and gum arabic as a binder. The result is an ink that starts out grayish when wet and gradually oxidizes to a deep black over hours or days. It's permanent, which is good for archival purposes but terrible when you make mistakes. The ink also has a tendency to be corrosive over centuries. Iron gall ink can actually eat through parchment, creating holes where letters used to be. Modern archivists dealing with medieval manuscripts spend a lot of time trying to stabilize iron gall ink damage. Making the ink was itself a skilled task, usually assigned to one monk who became the monastery's ink specialist. Getting the proportions right was crucial. Too much iron and the ink became corrosive and damaging. Too little and it faded to brown over time. Too thick and it wouldn't flow properly from the quill. Too thin and it bled into the parchment fibers, creating fuzzy letters. The ink maker experimented, adjusted recipes, carefully documented what worked, and produced batches that scribes then used for months. If you got a bad batch of ink, your entire scriptorium's work suffered. Good ink was valuable, carefully stored in sealed containers away from light and heat. The parchment under your quill represents an entire industrial process you're not seeing. Somewhere, probably in a workshop area of the monastery, animal skins are being processed. They're soaked in lime solution for days to loosen the hair and flesh. Then they're scraped with curved knives to remove all tissue, stretched on frames to dry while being scraped repeatedly to achieve even thickness. The dried skin is treated with pumice to smooth the surface, sometimes whitened with chalk, cut to size, and finally distributed to scribes. Each step requires skill and labor. Each animal skin might become 2 or 4 pages depending on its size and quality. A sheep produces enough parchment for maybe 8 to 12 pages of manuscript. Multiply that by the hundreds of pages in a complete book and you understand why manuscripts were so expensive. There's also vellum, which is parchment made from calf skin, and it's even more expensive and fine than regular parchment. Vellum is smoother, more uniform, takes ink better, and it's reserved for the most important manuscripts: Bibles, liturgical books, texts intended as gifts for important patrons. You're not working on vellum. You're working on regular sheep parchment that's slightly irregular, has occasional thin spots, and probably has a barely visible hair follicle pattern if you look closely. But it's still expensive, still valuable, still something you're expected to treat with utmost care while you slowly ruin it with your incompetent lettering. Your eyes are genuinely hurting now from the strain of afternoon work. Medieval scribes who did this for years often became partially or completely blind by middle age, their vision destroyed by decades of close work in poor light. Some monasteries developed rules limiting how many hours per day scribes could work, recognizing that they were consuming their vision as a resource that would eventually run out. Other monasteries pushed scribes until they couldn't see well enough to continue, at which point they were reassigned to other tasks, often manual labor that didn't require good vision, which must have been a depressing demotion for men who'd spent their lives as educated copyists. The smoke from the tallow candles is making everything worse. Your eyes are watering, your throat is scratchy, and the flickering light creates visual artifacts that make it even harder to see clearly. Medieval scribes just lived with this. They worked through the discomfort, the eye strain, the headaches that came from hours of intense focus in poor conditions. Some of those marginal complaints in manuscripts weren't just about tired hands, they were about exhausted eyes, splitting headaches, the desperate wish for natural light and fresh air. You shift on your stool, trying to ease your cramping back, and your movement causes the candle flame to dance wildly. Your shadow leaps across the parchment, momentarily obscuring your work. You freeze, waiting for the flame to steady, and in that moment you understand viscerally how fragile this entire operation is. One gust of wind through a poorly sealed window, one careless movement near a candle, and the scriptorium full of irreplaceable manuscripts, expensive parchment, months or years of labor could be engulfed in flames. The fire watch wasn't just about residential areas. It was about protecting repositories of knowledge and value that represented enormous investments of time, money, and effort. The bell for Vespers finally, mercifully rings. You've completed maybe 2/3 of a single page in an entire afternoon of work. A skilled scribe could have done 5 or 6 pages in the same time, each one perfect. You're not a skilled scribe. You're a disaster with a quill, and tomorrow you'll return to prove it all over again. The cycle continues. The suffering persists, and that parchment will bear the scars of your learning process like a medieval record of incompetence preserved for posterity. Assuming the monk master doesn't just scrape it clean and give it to someone competent to redo properly. The smell hits you first, and it's comprehensive in its awfulness, a layered assault on your olfactory senses that combines unwashed human bodies, wet wool that hasn't dried properly in weeks, communal latrines that are emptied irregularly at best, animal fat smoke from those eternal tallow candles, decaying food scraps, and underneath it all a musty dampness that speaks of stone buildings without proper ventilation or drainage. This is the smell of holiness, apparently the olfactory signature of medieval monastic life, and it's so pervasive that you've almost stopped noticing it except in moments when you take a deep breath and your modern sensibilities reassert themselves with a vengeance. Let's start with personal hygiene, or rather the almost complete lack thereof. The rule of Benedict mentions bathing, but only as something to be avoided except for the sick or the very elderly. Bathing was considered spiritually suspect, too much focus on bodily comfort, too much concern with physical cleanliness rather than spiritual purity. There's also a fascinating theological argument that developed in medieval Christianity. Your baptism had cleansed your soul, so why did your body need repeated cleansing? Physical dirt was meaningless compared to spiritual dirt, and excessive attention to washing suggested vanity and worldly concerns. So most monks bathed rarely, very rarely, maybe twice a year for the full immersion experience. If that, your body washes consisted of minimal face and hand rinsing, usually in cold water from the lavatorium, a stone basin near the refectory where monks performed cursory ablutions before meals. The water wasn't changed frequently, so by the time 20 monks had rinsed their hands in it, you were basically rubbing yourself with diluted communal grime. Soap existed but was expensive and primarily used for laundry rather than bodies. You might occasionally scrub your face with a rough cloth and cold water, but full body washing? That was a semi-annual event at best, often less frequent. The result is that you smell badly. Your armpits have transcended normal body odor into something approaching a biological presence of their own. Your scalp itches constantly from accumulated oil, dead skin, and probably some small wildlife that's taken up residence. Your feet, trapped in leather shoes that never fully dry, have developed their own ecosystem of bacteria that produces a smell so aggressive it could probably be weaponized. Your crotch and backside are experiencing medieval hygiene in its full glory, which means rashes, chafing, and odors that medieval people just accepted as normal human reality. You're not alone in this. Every monk in this monastery smells essentially the same, a uniform funk that fills every enclosed space and clings to the wool robes that never get washed. Speaking of those robes, medieval wool was naturally water-resistant due to the lanolin content, and that same lanolin trapped odors spectacularly well. The heavy will habit your wearing if you'd taken vows, and been given one would be your constant companion for years, possibly decades. It wasn't washed in the modern sense. It was occasionally aired out, hung in the sun if weather permitted, maybe beaten with sticks to dislodge some of the accumulated grime and insects. But actual washing with water? That would damage the wool, remove the protective oils, require days of drying time in a climate where dry was a relative concept. So monks wore unwashed wool robes that accumulated years of sweat, food spills, various bodily fluids, and general grime until the fabric itself became stiff and discolored with filth. The sleeping arrangements don't help. That thin blanket you're using, also unwashed, also accumulating your body's nightly output of oils and dead skin cells and sweat. The wooden plank you're sleeping on, never cleaned, just occasionally wiped down if something particularly offensive happened. Your cell has no ventilation beyond that narrow window slit, so all your body's nighttime emanations and humans produce a surprising amount of moisture and smell while sleeping just hang in the air, get absorbed by the stone walls, contribute to that general musty dampness that characterizes every enclosed space in the monastery. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Medieval people were intensely aware of smell and attributed medical significance to it. The theory of miasma held that disease was transmitted through bad air, through foul smells that carried corruption. Paradoxically, this didn't lead to better hygiene practices. Instead, it led to people carrying herbs and flowers to purify the air they breathed, or holding scented cloths to their noses when passing through particularly odoriferous areas. Monks might carry sprigs of rosemary or lavender from the monastery garden, tucking them into their robes to provide some olfactory relief, but actually bathing to eliminate the source of the smell. That remained theologically and practically problematic. The latrines deserve special mention because they're genuinely nightmarish by modern standards. The monastery has a communal latrine called a reredorer in architectural terms. That's essentially a long room with a wooden bench running along one side. The bench has holes cut into it at intervals, and those holes open onto a pit or, if the monastery is more sophisticated, a channel through which water flows to carry waste away. There's no privacy, no individual stalls, just that communal bench where monks sit side by side, performing their biological necessities in full view and smell of each other. The smell in the latrine is indescribable. Actually, it's very describable, but describing it accurately would violate the PG-13 guidelines we're operating under. Let's just say that human waste in various stages of decomposition, combined with minimal ventilation and irregular cleaning schedules, creates an atmosphere that makes your eyes water and your gag reflex activate before you're fully through the door. Medieval people had stronger stomachs for this kind of thing. They'd grown up with it. Their olfactory systems had adapted, but even they found latrines unpleasant. They just didn't have alternatives, so they tolerated it. Wiping materials consisted of whatever was available: straw, hay, moss, old cloth scraps, leaves in seasons when they were available. Toilet paper wouldn't be invented for centuries. Some monasteries maintained a communal wiping stick, a wooden implement with cloth or moss attached that everyone shared. Let that image settle in for a moment. A shared wiping stick. This is why medieval people died of intestinal parasites and infectious diseases at horrifying rates. The sanitation practices were essentially designed to transmit pathogens as efficiently as possible. Hand washing after latrine use was theoretically practiced but practically limited by the same constraints as all washing cold water. Minimal or no soap. Communal basins where you're washing in water that 20 other guys already used. You're not getting clean. You're redistributing bacteria. The concept of hot water for washing existed but was considered a luxury requiring fuel and effort that monasteries generally didn't expend on routine hygiene. Hot water was for cooking, for brewing, for tasks that absolutely required it. Your hands? Cold water or nothing. The combination of poor personal hygiene, unwashed clothing, communal latrines, and enclosed living spaces created ideal conditions for parasites. Lice were universal. Body lice, head lice, pubic lice. If it could infest a human, it was infesting medieval humans. Fleas were common, brought in by the rats and mice that inhabited every medieval building. Bedbugs nested in the wooden bed frames and came out at night to feed. Intestinal worms were widespread, transmitted through poor sanitation and contaminated food. Medieval people just had parasites. It was normal, expected. You might occasionally try to reduce the population through various folk remedies, but complete elimination was impossible under the living conditions. Skin infections were common for obvious reasons. Bacteria love warm, moist environments, and medieval skin constantly covered by wool, rarely washed, often broken by insect bites or scrapes, was paradise for bacterial colonies. Boils, abscesses, pustules, rashes, all routine occurrences that people treated with poultices and prayers and resigned acceptance. Some infections cleared up on their own. Others became serious medical problems. Without antibiotics, even minor infections could kill if they spread to the bloodstream or caused systemic complications. Dental hygiene was another disaster. Teeth were cleaned occasionally by rubbing them with cloth, maybe using some herb or salt as a mild abrasive. Toothbrushes wouldn't become common until centuries later. The result was universal tooth decay, accelerated by the gritty bread we mentioned earlier. All those stone fragments in medieval flour acted like sandpaper on tooth enamel, grinding it down and exposing the softer interior to decay. By middle age, most people had significant tooth loss. Many had chronic dental abscesses, painful infections at the root of decayed teeth that were impossible to treat effectively. Tooth extraction was the only solution for serious problems, and it was performed without anesthesia by whoever in the community was brave enough to try pulling teeth, which could be monks, barber surgeons, or just someone with strong hands and a pair of pliers. Bad breath was universal. Decaying teeth, poor diet, intestinal issues. No mints or mouthwash. Everyone had breath that could peel paint. This was another thing medieval people just accepted as normal human reality. There was no concept of fresh breath as a standard to maintain. Your mouth tasted terrible, smelled terrible, and felt terrible, and you lived with it because what alternative existed? The monastery's attempt at addressing smell involved incense during services. Frankincense and more expensive imports from the Middle East were burned in censers that were swung by designated monks during important liturgical moments. The sweet, resinous smoke was meant to purify the sacred space, to create an olfactory boundary between the earthly and the divine. It also helped mask the collective body odor of 30 unwashed monks in an enclosed chapel. The incense smoke mixed with the tallow smoke created a distinctive church smell that was probably more bearable than pure unwashed humanity, though not by as much as you'd hope. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually found each other's smells offensive or whether olfactory standards were just completely different. The evidence suggests both. Medieval people definitely noticed smell, their medical texts discuss it, their poetry references it, their etiquette guides address it, but their tolerance for what we'd consider offensive odors was obviously much higher than ours. They lived in it constantly, had no realistic way to eliminate it, so they adapted their standards to match their reality. What smells intolerable to you, your own body, after a week without bathing would have been completely normal to them. What they found offensive, really extreme rot, death, disease, we'd also find offensive, just at different thresholds. You're experiencing this adjustment right now. That first day, the smells were overwhelming, nauseating, impossible to ignore. Now, a few days in, your nose is adapting. You're still aware of the smell, but it's becoming background rather than foreground, a constant presence you're learning to filter out. Medieval people completed this adaptation in childhood and maintained it for life. You're crash coursing your way through olfactory desensitization, and your nose is cooperating because the alternative is constant misery. The chapter house where monks gather for daily meetings and administrative business has a particular smell concentration because it's one of the few spaces where everyone congregates while not in motion. 30 unwashed monks in an enclosed room, discussing monastery business. The smell compounds and intensifies until the air itself feels thick and organic. The abbot and senior monks occupy the better ventilated positions near windows. The junior monks and novices get the interior spaces where the air barely moves and the smell is most concentrated. Hierarchy even determines who has to breathe the worst air. The infirmary has its own special aromatic profile. Sick bodies, infected wounds, herbal medicines, urine collection containers used for medical diagnostics, and general sickness combined with the usual baseline monastery smell. Medieval medicine involved examining and sniffing various bodily fluids, urine, feces, sweat, breath, because smell was considered diagnostically important. A physician or herbalist could supposedly determine what was wrong with you partly by what you smelled like. This wasn't entirely superstition. Certain diseases do produce characteristic odors. But it meant the infirmary was a place where people were actively producing and examining smells that ranged from unpleasant to genuinely horrifying. The kitchen produced the only reliably positive smells in the entire monastery: bread baking, herbs simmering, onions cooking. These were temporary respites from the general funk. Brief moments when your nose encountered something actually pleasant. The kitchen monks were probably the only ones who regularly experienced positive olfactory sensations, though they also dealt with rotting food scraps, burned food smells, and the general accumulated grease and grime that characterized medieval cooking spaces. Your clothing, whatever modern garments you arrived in, has absorbed the monastery smell by now. Your hair, your skin, everything carries it. If you left today and returned to the modern world, people would smell you coming from yards away. You've become what you've been living in. Olfactorily speaking, the smell has colonized you, penetrated your fabric and pores, marked you as a resident of this aromatic nightmare. And the worst part? You're barely noticing it anymore. Your nose has surrendered. This is just what the world smells like now. This is normal. Welcome to medieval monastic hygiene, where bathing is suspicious, everyone has parasites, and the smell of unwashed humanity mixed with tallow smoke and communal latrines is just the olfactory baseline of daily existence. Your nose will never forgive you, but at least it stopped complaining quite so loudly. Small victories in a world where clean is a concept that simply doesn't apply to human bodies or the spaces they inhabit. The monastery's herb garden attempts to provide some aromatic relief, though even that's a mixed experience. Rosemary, lavender, sage, mint, these are growing in carefully tended beds, protected from November frost by whatever covering techniques the herbalist monk has devised. Medieval people used these herbs medicinally and also simply to smell, to provide brief moments of olfactory pleasure in a world that offered precious little. Monks might walk through the herb garden during free moments, crushing leaves between fingers to release scent, breathing deeply of something that wasn't human funk or tallow smoke or latrine vapors. But even the garden has its problems. The compost heap is nearby, necessary for fertilizing the herbs, and medieval compost was just decomposing organic matter in piles. Food scraps, animal waste, plant material, all rotting together to create fertilizer. The smell was intense, especially in warmer weather, though November's cold has reduced it to manageable levels. Still, even the herb garden, the one potentially pleasant-smelling space in the monastery, had its own aromatic challenges. The storage areas are another smell zone worth mentioning. Grain stored in sacks sometimes molded or attracted mice, producing musty, animal waste smells. Dried fish, a protein source for non-meat days, had its own powerful aroma that medieval people charitably described as strong, and modern people would call nauseating. Cheese in various stages of aging produced smells ranging from pleasantly sharp to aggressively funky. The storage cellars combined all of these into a complex bouquet that made working there a special kind of trial. You're also discovering that clothing gets contaminated with task-specific smells. Work in the stables and you carry horse manure smell for days, even after you've stopped working there. The wool absorbs it, your skin absorbs it, and short of bathing, which isn't happening, you just live with it. Copy manuscripts all day and you smell like ink and old parchment. Not unpleasant exactly, but distinctive. Work in the kitchen and you smell like cooking smoke and onions. Every task leaves its aromatic signature, layering onto your baseline personal funk until you're a walking catalog of medieval monastery activities, identifiable by scent alone. Medieval people developed strategies for coping with smell that seemed quaint or ineffective to us but represented genuine attempts at improvement. Strewing herbs on floors so they'd release scent when walked on. Hanging bundles of dried flowers or herbs in living spaces. Using scented oils on pulse points when they were available and affordable. These didn't eliminate underlying odors, but they provided olfactory distraction. Something pleasant to focus on instead of the pervasive funk. Monasteries that could afford it used more incense, burned scented wood in fires, maintained larger herb gardens specifically for aromatic purposes. But ultimately, the smell was just reality. You couldn't escape it, couldn't eliminate it, couldn't create the kind of baseline cleanliness that would prevent it. So you adapted. Your nose stopped registering it as noteworthy. Your standards adjusted to match your circumstances. What started as revolting became normal, then barely noticeable. This is human adaptability at work. We can adjust to almost anything if we're exposed to it long enough. Your nose has made peace with medieval monastery smell because continuing to find it offensive would mean living in constant distress. And your brain is too smart to let that happen. So you've normalized the smell of holiness, accepted that this is just what humans and their habitats smell like when stripped of modern hygiene practices and products. The sacred relics kept in the chapel have their own problematic relationship with smell. These are supposedly pieces of saints' bone fragments, bits of cloth that touched holy bodies, other physical remnants of the blessed dead, and they're kept in ornate reliquaries that are displayed during important services. The bones are old, very old, and while bone doesn't smell much on its own, the circumstances of their preservation and display mean they've been exposed to centuries of incense smoke, candle smoke, handling by unwashed hands, and general medieval conditions. The reliquaries get opened periodically for important visitors or special feast days, and the smell that emerges is musty, ancient, vaguely organic, not terrible, but not pleasant either. Still, this smell is considered holy, and monks venerate it along with the relics themselves, breathing deeply of sacred ancient bone vapor while praying for intercession. Your body is also developing its own new smells as it adapts to medieval conditions. The dietary changes: low protein, high carbohydrate, minimal fats are affecting your digestion and therefore your flatulence and excrement. Medieval bodies processed medieval food in ways that produced characteristic smells, and you're joining that club. The constant cold is affecting your circulation and therefore your sweat composition. The stress and exhaustion are triggering hormonal changes that affect body odor. You're becoming medievalized. Somatically speaking, your body transforming to match your circumstances, and the smell of that transformation is distinctly period appropriate. The ultimate truth is this: medieval monasteries smelled like concentrated humanity with minimal hygiene, and everyone just lived with it because alternatives didn't exist. You can burn incense, plant herbs, air out buildings, and do 100 small mitigating things, but you can't eliminate the fundamental reality that unwashed people in unwashed clothes living in poorly ventilated buildings produce a powerful and pervasive smell. Modern people would find it intolerable. Medieval people found it normal. You're somewhere in between, still aware enough to find it unpleasant, but adapted enough that you can function within it. Your nose has surrendered to reality, and that's probably the kindest thing it could do for your continued mental health in this aromatic nightmare you're now calling home. The bell rings for matins again, of course it does, because time is circular in this place, because yesterday and today and tomorrow are all the same day repeated infinitely, because you've somehow survived multiple cycles of this routine and the realization is settling in with crushing weight. This isn't a day. This was never just a day. This is life. This is the rest of your existence if you stay. Every single thing you've experienced: the cold, the hunger, the exhaustion, the pain, the smell, the silence, the endless labor isn't an aberration or a trial period. It's the permanent condition. It's the deal. And medieval monks chose this, or had it chosen for them, and then lived it for decades until death released them into the monastery cemetery, where at least the stone was no longer cold because they were beyond feeling anything. You're lying on your wooden plank in the pre-dawn darkness, listening to the bell's insistent clangor, and your body is refusing commands. Not dramatically, not with rebellion, just with the dull non-responsiveness of a system that's been pushed beyond its design parameters. Your muscles aren't recovering between work sessions. Your sleep debt is accumulating into a deficit that no amount of napping could address, even if napping were permitted, which it isn't. Your caloric intake is insufficient for your output, so your body is slowly consuming itself, breaking down muscle tissue to fuel basic functions, creating a gradual decline that will continue until you either leave or die or somehow adapt enough that the decline stabilizes at some minimal sustainable level. The eternal recurrence is the horror. That's what you're understanding now, in this dark cell, with that bell commanding you to rise for the 1,000th time, except it's maybe the 5th or 6th time for you, But that number is irrelevant because it's going to be 1,000, 10,000, until the number itself becomes meaningless and you're just a body responding to bells, a component in a machine that runs on human suffering converted into prayer. The Benedictine routine isn't designed to be endured once. It's designed to be endured forever. The schedule that's destroying you is the same schedule you'll follow tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, for the next 30 or 40 or 50 years if you live that long, which many monks didn't because this life consumed them. You force yourself upright. The cold is immediate and absolute. As always, your knees are genuinely damaged now. You can feel it in the way they move. The grinding sensation that suggests cartilage damage. The sharp pains that shoot up your legs with certain movements. Medieval monks developed permanent knee problems, and you're speed-running your way toward joining that club. Your hands are still blistered and now infected. You can see the red inflammation around the wounds, feel the heat of infection, and there's no antibiotics coming, just that herbal salve that maybe helps or maybe does nothing while your immune system fights or fails to fight the bacteria colonizing your broken skin. The procession to the chapel happens again. Same cold corridors, same silent shuffling monks, same gradual gathering in the candlelit space that smells like tallow smoke and unwashed wool and centuries of human exhalation. You take your place on the stone floor, kneeling with damaged knees on cold stone, and the service begins. The Latin washes over you meaningless sounds, beautiful in their way, the human voice in collective worship, but still meaningless to your untrained ear. The abbot chants, the monks respond, the psalms cycle through their prescribed order, and you're just there, a body in space, occupying your designated position in the machine. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Benedictine rule wasn't uniquely harsh. Other monastic orders made Benedict's routine look positively gentle. The Carthusians lived in near-total isolation, spoke almost never, ate minimal food, maintained routines that made Benedictine life seem communal and indulgent by comparison. The Cistercians reformed Benedictine practices in the 12th century, arguing for stricter poverty, harder manual labor, more austere conditions. Medieval Christianity developed multiple frameworks for spiritual discipline, and they competed partly on who could endure the most suffering while maintaining community function. The goal was always the same: break the body to liberate the soul, destroy earthly attachments to achieve heavenly connection, suffer now to avoid eternal suffering later. The theological logic was impeccable if you accepted the premises. Earthly life is temporary and meaningless except as preparation for eternity. Physical comfort distracts from spiritual development. Suffering purifies, humbles, redirects attention from the temporal to the eternal. Therefore, a life deliberately structured to maximize suffering or discipline, in the preferred terminology, was a life well lived, a life that honored God through rejection of worldly pleasure. Medieval people genuinely believed this. They structured entire institutions around it. They recruited thousands of men and women to live this way. And many of those people genuinely found meaning in it, genuinely experienced their suffering as spiritually productive, genuinely died believing they'd earned heavenly reward through earthly deprivation. But many didn't. The historical record hints at this through the gaps, the silences, the occasional chronicle that mentions monks who left the religious life, which was often code for couldn't take it anymore and fled. Some monasteries developed reputations as strict or lenient based on how rigidly they enforced the rule, and monks would sometimes transfer between houses seeking better conditions. Some became what were called gyrovagues, wandering monks who moved from monastery to monastery, always finding reasons to leave after the initial welcome period ended and serious discipline began. These were considered failures, men who'd made vows they couldn't keep, and they faced social and ecclesiastical consequences. But their existence tells us that not everyone could endure this life, that breaking points were real and common enough to require terminology. You're approaching your own breaking point, and you can feel it. It's not one dramatic thing, not the cold or the hunger or the exhaustion individualizes the totality. It's the realization that this never improves, never gets easier in any meaningful way, never offers respite or relief or even the hope that tomorrow might be different from today. It's the eternal recurrence made flesh, the same day repeating until it kills you or you kill yourself or you flee back to the world you came from, where thermostats exist and food has flavor and sleep is a thing humans are allowed to experience in adequate quantities. The Matins service continues. Your mind is drifting now, unable to maintain focus, experiencing the dissociative state that comes from extreme and chronic stress. You're aware of the chapel, the cold, the other monks, but there's distance to it, like you're watching yourself from outside your body, observing this medieval person in medieval circumstances going through medieval motions. This is actually a documented psychological phenomenon among people in extreme conditions. The mind protects itself by creating distance from unbearable present circumstances, watching rather than fully inhabiting the experience. Historians still argue whether medieval mystics' visions were genuine spiritual experiences or just dissociation from extreme deprivation. But the line between those categories might not be as clear as we think. The service ends. Dawn is approaching. You can see the faintest gray light beginning to filter through those narrow windows. Another day, another cycle. Lauds will follow Matins after a brief interval. Then prime. Then the day's work assignments. Then terce. Then more work. Then sext. Then the inadequate midday meal. Then none. Then more work. Then vespers. Then the pitiful supper. Then compline. Then the cold cell and the wooden plank and the thin blanket and a few hours of fitful sleep before Matins rips you back to consciousness and it all begins again. You're learning what medieval monks learned. Time doesn't pass in this place. It circles. The liturgical calendar creates the illusion of progression, different feast days, different seasons, different readings in the services, but the fundamental structure never changes. You're trapped in a loop, and the only exit is death or breaking your vows. And breaking your vows might be the worst option depending on your beliefs about eternal consequences. Medieval monks lived in this temporal prison, and some found transcendence within it, achieving states of spiritual elevation that justified and redeemed all suffering. Others just endured, survived, got through each day without achieving anything like transcendence, just maintaining function until they couldn't anymore. The young novice who dropped his bowl days ago is looking worse. His face has a grayish pallor that suggests malnutrition or illness or both. His movements are slower, more effortful. He's not adapting well to this life, and everyone can see it. And no one is helping because helping would suggest weakness in both parties. He has to find his own strength, develop his own adaptation, or fail. Those are the options. The monastic system isn't designed for individual accommodation. It's designed for uniform compliance, and those who can't comply are filtered out through attrition. They leave, or they die, or they suffer indefinitely in marginal positions doing the worst work and receiving the least consideration. You're not sure which category you're falling into. You're still functional, technically, You're completing assigned tasks, attending services, maintaining the silence, following the rules. But you're depleting, eroding, losing capacity with each cycle. The question is whether you'll stabilize, whether your body will find some equilibrium where it can sustain this routine indefinitely, or whether you'll continue declining until something breaks catastrophically. Medieval monasteries had infirmaries for a reason. Monks got sick, got injured, developed chronic conditions that required care. Some recovered and returned to normal routine. Others lingered in the infirmary until death, unable to maintain the full schedule but also unable or unwilling to leave. The work assignment today is hauling firewood, which sounds straightforward until you understand the scale. The monastery needs vast quantities of wood for cooking, heating water, limited space heating in specific areas, and various industrial processes. The wood comes from the monastery's forest holdings, is cut and seasoned and transported to storage areas, then distributed as needed. Your job is moving split logs from outdoor storage to the kitchen area, one armload at a time, across the cold November courtyard, in wind that cuts through your insufficient clothing and finds every gap and opening. Your body doesn't want to do this. Your muscles are protesting before you even begin. Your blistered hands are going to hate every rough log surface. Your back, already damaged from scribal work and general monastery life, is going to suffer under the weight and repetitive bending. But the monk master is watching, and the work needs doing, so you begin. Bend, gather logs, lift, carry, stack, return, repeat, again. The physical task is mindless, which makes it meditative in theory but actually just allows your mind to catalog every pain, every discomfort, every reason this is unsustainable. The other monks working alongside you are efficient and uncomplaining as always. They've developed the physical adaptations, the calluses, the muscle memory, the metabolic adjustments that make this work manageable for them. They've also developed the mental framework that interprets this suffering as meaningful, as spiritually productive, as bringing them closer to God through mortification of the flesh. You don't have that framework. You just have the suffering, stripped of redemptive meaning, pure and pointless and endless. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually experienced less physical pain than we do, or whether they just had different cultural frameworks for interpreting it. Modern pain management emphasizes eliminating pain whenever possible, treating it as a purely negative experience. Medieval Christianity treated pain as potentially redemptive, as an opportunity to share in Christ's suffering, as a means of spiritual growth. So the same sensation might be experienced differently depending on the cultural and theological context. A medieval monk with damaged knees might feel the same physical pain you do, but interpret it as a gift, an opportunity, a sign of God's special attention. You interpret it as joint damage requiring medical intervention you're not going to receive. The work continues for hours. Your world narrows to the repetitive task. Bend, lift, carry, stack. Your hands are bleeding again, the logs are rough, full of splinters, and your blistered palms have reopened. Blood is making the logs slippery, making your grip uncertain. You adjust, compensate, continue. The monk master watches periodically, ensuring adequate effort, looking for signs of malingering or insufficient dedication. You perform for his gaze, demonstrating compliance even though your body is failing, even though every movement hurts, Even though you've transcended tiredness into some realm where exhaustion is your baseline state and you no longer remember what rested feels like. The bell rings for sext, midday prayers. You abandon the logs gratefully and join the procession to the chapel. The service is brief, 20 minutes of standing and kneeling and Latin psalms. Then back to work. Then none. Then the midday meal, more bland pottage, more dense bread, more eating in silence while listening to incomprehensible Latin readings. The food barely touches your hunger. Your body needs far more calories than it's receiving, but the portions are fixed and there's no seconds, no supplementation, no accommodation for the fact that you're burning through your reserves at an unsustainable rate. The afternoon brings more wood hauling, more pain, more repetition. The sun is already descending toward the horizon. November days are short, and you're running out of useful daylight. Your shadow stretches long across the courtyard as you make yet another trip from storage to kitchen. Your arms trembling under the weight of logs that shouldn't be heavy but feel like they weigh hundreds of pounds because your muscles are depleted and failing. You're operating on will alone now, nothing left in reserve, just forcing yourself through motions because stopping would mean facing consequences you're not prepared to handle. Vespers finally arrives, releasing you from labor into the mercy of prayer. The chapel service feels almost restful by comparison to wood hauling, even though you're kneeling on stone with damaged knees in a freezing building. At least you're not lifting things. At least you're not moving. The bar for comfort has dropped so low that not actively engaged in painful labor qualifies as relief. This is adaptation, recalibration of expectations to match reality. Medieval monks experienced this transformation and emerged on the other side as men who genuinely preferred the monastery's harsh routine to the uncertainties of secular life. Or they didn't emerge, and they broke, and history mostly forgets them because broken monks don't leave impressive records. Supper is the usual minimal offering bread, maybe some thin ale or watered wine, a small piece of cheese if you're lucky. Compline follows, the final service releasing you to your cell for the night's inadequate sleep. You collapse on your wooden plank, pull your thin blanket over your shivering body, and close your eyes. Tomorrow is coming. It will be exactly like today, and the day after will be exactly like tomorrow. The eternal recurrence continues. The cycle perpetuates. The routine grinds forward with mechanical precision regardless of your suffering or adaptation or breaking point. This is what you wouldn't survive. Not one day of medieval monastic life, but the realization that there is no one day. There's only an infinite series of identical days, each one grinding you down a little more, each one requiring you to find strength. You don't have to continue a routine that offers no relief, no improvement, no hope of change. Medieval monks who survived this life did so by finding meaning in the suffering, by genuinely believing their daily misery purchased eternal salvation, by developing psychological and spiritual frameworks that made sense of the senseless. Without that framework, you're just suffering for its own sake, and human beings can't sustain that indefinitely. But the bell will ring again in a few hours. Matins will call you back to the cold chapel, back to the stone floor, back to the Latin psalms and the tallow smoke and the kneeling that destroys your joints and the cold that steals your warmth and the hunger that hollows your body. The cycle continues. The eternal recurrence persists. And you're learning that wouldn't last a day is actually generous. You wouldn't last a lifetime, and a lifetime is what this requires. The day isn't the challenge. The day is just the unit measurement for an infinity of days. And that infinity is what breaks you, slowly and inevitably, unless you find something stronger than suffering to sustain you through it. Your eyes close. Your body demands sleep it won't adequately receive. And tomorrow identical to today, identical to yesterday, identical to every day that will follow waits with patient inevitability. The monastery doesn't change. The routine doesn't adapt. You either transform to survive it, or you don't survive. Those are the options. Those have always been the options. And medieval monks faced them every single day until death finally offered the only permanent relief from the eternal, exhausting, unchanging cycle of prayer and suffering that defined every moment of their existence. Now let the images slowly fade as sleep pulls you under. The candlelight dims in your mind, becoming softer, warmer, less harsh. The cold retreats to the edges of awareness, still present but distant now, as if happening to someone else. Your breathing slows, deepens, finding a rhythm that matches the quiet heartbeat of the monastery settling into its night routine. The bells will ring again, yes, but for now, for these precious moments, there's only the darkness and the stillness and the mercy of unconsciousness. Your body relaxes into the wooden plank, no longer fighting the hardness, just accepting it as the surface where rest happens. The thin blanket becomes adequate, somehow, in this transitional space between waking and sleeping. The smell fades from your attention. The cold becomes neutral. The pain transforms into distant information that doesn't require response. You're drifting now, floating in that space where the medieval world starts to blur and soften, where suffering becomes abstract, where you can almost imagine that tomorrow might be different, might be easier, might offer something beyond repetition. The monastery breathes around you, stone walls exhaling the day's accumulated cold, wooden beams creaking their ancient complaints, wind whispering through narrow windows. Somewhere a monk coughs softly, the sound absorbed quickly by the darkness. Somewhere else a bell tower creaks as the bell ropes settle. The whole vast complex of cold stone and suffering humanity finds its nighttime equilibrium, all of you together in this strange communal isolation, all of you enduring the same eternal routine, all of you seeking something transcendence, or peace, or just survival until morning. And morning will come, as it always does, announced by that insistent bell calling you back to begin again. But that's future. That's not now. Now is this moment of quiet, of rest, of surrender to sleep and the temporary mercy it offers. Your thoughts slow and scatter like leaves in wind, losing coherence, losing urgency, losing the sharp edges that made them painful. The day's experiences, the cold, the work, the hunger, the endless kneeling become memories rather than present reality. Stories your mind tells itself as it drifts toward unconsciousness. Sleep finds you finally, completely, pulling you down into darkness deeper than the medieval night, into rest that's earned through suffering and scarcity. And in that sleep, perhaps dreams come, dreams of warmth, a plenty, of a world where bells don't ring and bodies don't ache and time moves forward instead of circling endlessly. Or perhaps there are no dreams, just the blank mercy of exhausted unconsciousness, the body's emergency shutdown protocol activating to force rest despite conditions that make rest nearly impossible. Either way, you're carried through these remaining night hours on the current of sleep, beyond pain and cold and hunger, beyond the eternal recurrence of the monastic routine, beyond everything except the quiet persistence of breath and heartbeat. Tomorrow waits, unchanging and inevitable, but tonight, in this moment, There's peace. There's rest. There's the soft darkness that asks nothing and offers the only kindness this life permits. Temporary absence from yourself, from this place, from the endless cycle that defines existence between these cold stone walls. Rest now. Let it all fade. The monastery will still be here when you wake. The routine will still be waiting. The suffering will still be real. But for now, for these precious hours, you're released. You're free. You're simply sleeping, breathing, existing without suffering for a little while. And that's enough. That's everything. That's the small mercy that makes tomorrow possible. Even if tomorrow is just today repeated, even if the cycle never breaks, even if this is all there ever is. Sleep, dream of warmth if dreams come, and when the bell rings again, you'll rise, you'll continue, you'll endure, because that's what humans do, what medieval monks did, what we all do when faced with circumstances we cannot change. We adapt, we persist, we find the strength for one more day, and then one more after that. The eternal recurrence continues. But so do we, until we don't. Until the body finally fails, or the spirit finally breaks, or death finally arrives to end the cycle permanently. But that's not tonight. Tonight is just sleep, just rest, just the quiet darkness holding you gently until morning returns and the eternal cycle begins again. Sweet dreams, traveler. May your sleep be deeper than this wooden plank, warmer than this thin blanket, longer than these few stolen hours before the bell rings again.